This is a question I get asked all the time, so I wanted to make an extremely detailed video answering this question and going over which survivors you should buy or level up first based on their unique perks. Obviously, all of these rankings will be subjective based on my own playstyles and experiences, but I will try to explain everything as objectively as I can so you can make informed decisions on who you may want to unlock. For each of these perks, I will be giving them a score from 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest, and I'll be placing each survivor on a tier list. Although just note that the tier list will not be based on the survivor's total number of points, because some survivors have 1 amazing perk and 2 terrible perks, but are still worth getting for that single amazing perk. I'm basing most of the scores for the perks on their overall impact in a round, or whether or not they're versatile in a lot of situations. Since I am a human being, I do make mistakes sometimes, especially when there are 149 survivor perks in this game, so if there's anything that I say in this video that is outdated or wasn't clarified properly, feel free to let me know in the comments and I will try to put all corrections in the description below. This video took an extremely long time to make, so if we could get to 10,000 likes on this video, that would be incredible. With that being said, let's get right into the list. We are going in order of release date, and I will have all timestamps in the description below. All right, we're going to start with Dwight, the legend himself. He has the perk Bond, which shows you the auras of all other survivors within 36 meters. Very simple concept. This perk just gives you free information. It's great if you're a solo queue survivor and need to find people to heal you, or just generally knowing where people are and what they're doing. Overall, I would give this perk nowadays a 3. I think it used to be a 4, but now that we have the survivor HUD and the survivor HUD keeps getting more and more information perks are unfortunately becoming a little bit less useful. I will say, however, this perk is very good if you're going for flashlight saves with a friend or going for head-on saves or something, because then you can see exactly where the people are. So like if you're going for a flashlight save, if you're following someone that's in a chase, you'll be able to find them so much easier rather than just relying on the terror radius. Then he has leader, which makes it so that any other survivor within 8 meters of your location has their action speeds increased by 25%. 25% is surprisingly good, and it's always like really satisfying when somebody on your team has leader, but leader only applies to cleansing, opening gates, healing, sabotaging, unhooking, and unlocking chests, which, don't get me wrong, is useful, especially for healing. However, I do think there are other efficiency perks that do a much better job than this one and give you more bang for your buck, if that makes sense, and we'll get to those later in this video. So for leader, I'm going to give it a 2. I think it can be useful in some situations, but in general, it'll only save you a couple seconds of time, and it buffs your other teammates. It doesn't even buff yourself. And then his last perk is Prove Thyself, which increases your repair speed by 10% per other survivor that's on the generator with you, up to a maximum of 30%, obviously, because there can only be 3 other survivors. And the point of this perk is essentially to reduce the slowdown that you get from working on a gen with other survivors. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe for every other survivor that's on the gen, your repair speed is reduced by 15%. So this offsets that downside a little bit. I'm going to give this perk a 3 because obviously anything that increases gen progression is a very useful perk, but because they've nerfed this perk to the point where it doesn't fully offset the downside of working on gens with other people, I would say it's relatively balanced now and it's not as OP as it used to be. But in general, the most efficient thing to do as a survivor is work on separate gens, because A, you're getting more gen progression done, and B, the killer can't pressure multiple people if they come to that gen, so sometimes it'll encourage you to be in situations that you shouldn't be in otherwise. Overall, that puts Dwight in the A tier with 8 total points. Again, like I said earlier, some survivors will be bumped up or down depending on whether or not I think they're worth getting, even if their total number of points is supposed to be in a specific tier. All right, next up on the list, we have Meg Thomas herself. Her first perk is Adrenaline, which is absolutely going to get a 5. Adrenaline is one of the best perks in the entire game, in my opinion, even with the nerf that they just recently did. It makes it so that when the last gen is popped, you instantly heal the equivalent of 1 health state. So if you're injured, you become healthy. If you're down on the ground, you become injured. And if you're in deep wound, it heals your deep wound. And then you get a 50% haste for 3 seconds. So you basically get a sprint burst, and then you become exhausted for 40 seconds. This perk is phenomenal. Obviously, it's better if you're in a coordinated team, even just with one other person who can pop the gen when you go, for a rescue or something. But in general, this perk just gives you so much value, and it's a very well-designed perk because you're being rewarded for finishing the gens. I personally really enjoy running this perk. I think it's a ton of fun because, especially if you're on comms with some friends, you can coordinate with this perk very well. So for example, if I have Adrenaline and the killer is chasing somebody who's on death hook, I can go take the pressure off of them, go down for them, and then have my friend pop the gen, instantly bringing me back up and giving my friend more time to get out of the situation and stay alive. It's a very, very useful perk that comes in clutch way more than you think, with the obvious downside that it's completely useless if you never finish the gens. But there are so many situations when you do finish the gens that this perk comes in clutch that it is just unbelievably good and is absolutely deserving of a 5. Her next perk is Quick and Quiet, which I honestly think is pretty underrated, but it's still relatively mediocre, at least by itself. This makes it so that you make 0 sound when you fastfall a window, a pallet, or a locker, and then it goes on cooldown for 20 seconds. I think this can be surprisingly useful in some situations, but a lot of the times it's pretty obvious for the killer, especially if they have line of sight of you. However, However, if you are able to break line of sight, it might throw the killer off, they might lose you, or they might think that you faked the window vault and it might confuse them. It's also somewhat useful for stealth playstyles. And then of course it pairs well with quite a few synergies and combinations, such as with Head On or with Lithe and Dance With Me, which we'll talk about later in the video. So it can be somewhat useful. You just kind of have to make an entire build around it. If you're just running it alone, it's not very good. So I'm going to give this perk a 2. However, if you're using an entire build revolved around this perk, then I could see it being bumped up to a 3 or even a 4 in some situations, which we'll talk about later in this video. And then of course her last perk is Sprint Burst, which at higher levels is one of the top 5 best perks in the game in my opinion. You know those gaming memes where it's like a bell curve and everyone at the bottom has the same opinion that everyone at the top, and then everyone at the middle has a completely different opinion? This perk is kind of like that, because everyone when they first start playing the game thinks that Sprint Burst is like this god tier perk, and then as you get more experience and you're a little bit more average at the game, you start to think that Sprint Burst is really bad because you think you're just having to walk around the map the entire game. And then once you get into like the top 20% of players, you start to realize that this perk is actually really insane once you know how to use it. But learning how to use it properly takes so much time. Like the amount of situational awareness and the amount of experience and timing that you have to have with this perk takes hundreds, if not thousands of hours to master. This perk has a very, very, very high skill ceiling, and it gets even higher every time a new perk and a new map and a new killer is added. People seem to think that being good at this perk just means 99ing it, but that's only like a quarter of the things that you need to know to use this perk properly. Regardless, this perk is phenomenal and is absolutely the best exhaustion perk in the game. It just low-key requires a lot of brain power to use properly, so that's why you don't see it as often as other things that are simpler, like you don't really have to actively think about them. But overall, of course, Meg is going in the S tier. She has a total of 12 points. She is definitely one of the top 3 survivors that you should be buying first because of Sprint Burst and Adrenaline, which can be useful in almost every single game. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, I did just do a merch drop the other day. I really tried to make it look like regular clothes people would actually wear and not just slap my logo on it, and I think it turned out great. There's 2 versions, a pink cherry blossom version, which is like the regular edition, and then a gold edition with Subject 1 branding in reference to my DBD experiment videos. But the really cool thing that I'm super excited about is that the shirts and the hoodies have this unique feature where you get your own exclusive subject number depending on your position in the order, and there's only 100 of them. So they're limited, exclusive, and unique to you. So for example, if you're the 15th person to purchase the gold edition hoodie, the number on the hoodie will say Subject 15. It's awesome. We also have mouse pads and posters and stickers and all those accessories, so if you're interested in any of this, feel free to go to the link in the description and come check it out. We already have a ton of orders, which is insane, so I really appreciate all your guys' support. All right, the next survivor on our list is Claudette, and her first perk is Botany Knowledge. I think Botany Knowledge is a very solid healing perk. It's a very middle of the road perk in general, but in terms of healing, because obviously that's what it specializes in, it is pretty useful. It increases your healing speed by 50%, which can be very useful and very clutch in certain situations. For example, if the killer is slugging and you need to get people up quickly, or if you just need to reset so you can go for a save. It's not as good as some other healing perks like We'll Make It, for example, but since it's a blanket across the board buff, it's a much more versatile and well-rounded perk, if that makes sense. So overall, I'm going to give this a 3. I think it's useful in plenty of situations, especially if you're doing a healing build, but there is a major downside of this perk, and it's the fact that it reduces your medkit efficiency by 20%. So you're required to bring charge add-ons for your medkit if you want to self-heal and receive the buff. Her next perk is Empathy, and this is one of my favorite perks in the game. I'm still going to give it a score of a 3 though, because again, with the Survivor HUD becoming a thing, information perks have become a little less useful, but essentially the entire point of this perk is that it shows you the auras of any injured survivor. There is technically a distance of 128 meters, but that's like a majority of the map, so it's essentially unlimited range. I love this perk because I love going for flashlight saves and such, and obviously when someone becomes injured, they're most likely in a chase, so you can go to them immediately. It's a very fun perk if you have an aggressive and altruistic playstyle, and even if you're solo queuing, it's a good way to see where the killer is chasing a survivor and what that survivor is doing. So for example, you could see them, drop Shack Pallet at 5 gens, so you know that you should DC, or you can even gather information about what your teammates might have in terms of perks. So pretty decent info overall, and I personally like this better than Bond. And then her last perk is Self-Care, which is absolutely garbage. This perk is terrible and you should never use it. It's been nerfed like 20 times. There's really no point in bringing this over a medkit. I would say it's only useful in very, very niche situations where it's like you and one other survivor, but that survivor's on the hook and the killer's camping, and you have to reset to be able to get the save and get them out. Very situational moments like that can be somewhat useful, but in general, this perk is garbage. I know that a lot of you newer survivors like this perk because you feel safer when you're healthy, but I promise you, if you had an empty perk slot instead of this perk, you would probably win more games. A majority of this time, this perk is actually detrimental unless you're like a very, very experienced survivor who has more than like at least 1,000 hours, maybe even 2,000, person who knows exactly what situations to use self-care in. This is a complete noob trap of a perk, so I try to stay away from it as much as possible. I just realized I didn't even explain what it does. You can heal yourself without a med kit at a reduced speed of 35%. So I think it'll take you around 42 seconds or something to self-heal. It is way too long, and it's not worth running at all, I promise. That gives Claudette a total of 7 points, placing her in the B tier. All right, moving on to Jake Park. His first perk is Calm Spirit, which does a couple things. One, it prevents you from spooking crows. This is surprisingly useful against very, very good killers, but most killers don't use crows to track survivors. It also prevents you from screaming by any means, which is obviously very good against very specific things, such as killers using the perk Infectious Fright, or killers such as the Doctor. But of course, those are extremely niche situations. And then the last thing that it does is it makes you completely silent when you're searching a chest or cleansing or blessing totems, albeit at a 30% reduced speed. I will never in a million years understand why this 30% reduction in speed is here. Like, if someone could explain to me the logic behind this, that would be great. But searching a chest or blessing / cleansing a totem completely silently isn't that big of a deal. Like, especially in this current meta where hex perks are kind of useless. Although I guess there was that thrill of the hunt thing that just happened. But besides that, hex perks don't really get used that often unless it's like Plaything Pentimento, and you don't necessarily need to guard your hex totems for that combo. So it's just a very dumb downside in my opinion. And even if you were going against a hex build, it would be more useful to cleanse the totem faster rather than cleansing it silently. So it almost has bigger downsides than it does upsides. And then for the rest of the perk that we talked about earlier, it's just way too situational and way too niche to be useful. So I'm going to give this perk a 1. For Iron Will, my beloved, I love this perk. They did recently buff it back to 100% silence when you're injured, which is a very useful effect for both stealth players and for aggressive players. I don't think it's like game breaking or anything at all, but it's such a fun perk to use because it allows you to do a lot of really interesting things in chase, like window techs and just various things to lose the killer. I'm very happy that Behavior decided to buff this perk back to 100% silence when injured, because that was the reason that this perk was fun to use. And when it wasn't 100%, it was essentially useless. However, they still kept the thing where if you're exhausted, Iron Will completely deactivates, which I think is a perfectly fine balance change. It still lets you use the full potential of this perk, but it nerfs it just enough to where it's not active for like the entire match. Overall, I'm going to give this perk a score of 4. I think it's very useful, especially for the aggressive playstyle that I personally enjoy, but overall, I think it's useful in chase as well for anybody. So I would highly recommend using this perk. And last but not least, he has Saboteur, which does 2 different things. One, it shows you the aura of every nearby hook when a survivor is picked up, including Scourge hooks, which will be highlighted in yellow, which is kind of cool. And then it also gives you the ability to sabotage hooks without a toolbox. Granted, nobody actually really does that. Unfortunately, sabotaging hooks isn't as useful anymore. It can still absolutely come in clutch, especially if the killer is kind of unaware of their situation. But a lot of the situations where you will sabotage a hook, the killer will still be able to get to another hook in time. So you either have to make a full build surrounding this perk, or you have to have multiple survivors taking hits for the survivor that's on the shoulder. So yes, it can be situationally very good, but in a majority of situations, it's kind of a waste of a perk slot in my opinion, although it is a very fun perk to try to do a Sabo build. In general though, I'm going to give it a score of 2, which brings Jake into the B tier with a total of 7 points. However, I'm going to move him above Claudette because I think just for Iron Will alone, he's worth it, and I may even bump him up to A tier later in this video because I think Iron Will is definitely worth getting. I'm also super excited to announce that I've launched a free DBD fan game called Dead by Daylight Observation Experiment. If you've ever heard of the I'm on Observation Duty series or Alternate Watch, this is a DBD themed game with the same exact mechanics, but it also has a ton of lore, puzzles, and hidden secrets that will take you down this wild rabbit hole. I've been hanging out in streamers' chats, watching them play, and they've been having a blast. So if you want to check it out, I have it linked in the description below. Again, it's a completely free-to-play fan game made entirely by me. I spent like a year working on this, learning game development and learning Unreal so I could provide you guys with an interactive experience. So I hope you all enjoy it, and if you stream it or you record it, feel free to send me a link on Twitter or in Discord, and I'll try my best to check it out. Moving on to my main, of course, this is Nia Carlson. Nia's first perk is Balanced Landing, which I think is like the most middle of the road exhaustion perk in the game. It reduces your fall fatigue by 75% and makes you completely silent from the falling sounds. And then when you land, you get a sprint burst for 3 seconds and you get exhausted for 40 seconds, which disables all the effects of this perk. Whenever I'm playing killer and I see someone with Balanced Landing, it makes me so happy. Like, if you use Balanced Landing, you are an S tier person. Like, anyone who uses this perk is so based. This perk is pretty strong, don't get me wrong. The only downside of this perk is that it's so inconsistent because it's really dependent on the map that you have. There's some maps where the only place to use this perk is on the basement stairs, which obviously isn't very useful, or on the hill, which can be useful, but it's still like like you have to be in those very specific areas of the map to be able to get use out of this perk. But on some maps, it can be really strong. Like on Haddonfield, where you have the upper story houses and then you have the entire dead zones in the middle of the map. Being able to drop from the house, use that distance to get across the street, across that dead zone, and make it to another house can be surprisingly useful. So I'm going to give it a 3 because I think it's a very middle of the road perk. It can be good in a lot of situations, but it can be bad in a lot of situations. But overall, I think this perk does more good than harm. Her next perk is Streetwise, which just increases the efficiency of your items by 25%, and it also affects other survivors that are within 8 meters of your location. This perk is fine. I'm going to give it like a 2. It's somewhat useful for items such as toolboxes if you're trying to gen rush, or even if like someone is healing you with a med kit, but most people just use med kits to heal themselves. In general, I don't particularly think that this is worth a perk slot unless you're doing a very specific build, like an infinite flashlight build or something. But I would say overall, just stick to charge add-ons and use a different perk instead of this. And lastly, she has Urban Evasion. I know a lot of you like this perk, but I promise you it is not good. There are approximately 4 situations where this perk is useful. I'll be nice and give it 5, with that 5th one being stealth playstyles. If you enjoy a stealth playstyle, sure, this perk can be somewhat useful. The issue is that the stealth playstyle isn't really built for this game anymore. So if you are using that playstyle, it's kind of at the detriment of your teammates. Like, don't get me wrong, play however you enjoy playing. If you enjoy hiding from the killer and you enjoy staying out of chase, do that. Like, by all means, like, you bought the game, you do whatever you want. Just know that you're likely losing more games than you need to be. This perk increases your crouching movement speed by 100%, making you crouch at double the speed. And in my opinion, there's only 4 useful situations, and that is against the twins, which nobody plays, because if you're crouching while Victor's idle, he doesn't actually detect you. It's useful against ranged killers if you're in a loop that's not high enough to block you from their attacks. I would say that is the most useful part of this perk because you can still loop while guaranteeing safety. And then it's useful against Pyramid Head because you can crouch over his trails, but that saves you like half a second of time. You could just crouch over it normally. And then the last thing I can think of is against Hag because you can crouch up to her traps to get rid of them. But nobody plays Hag. So in general, the actual usefulness of this perk is way too situational and is only really useful against a couple of the killers in the entire roster. So I'm going to give it a score of 1. It's kind of a meme perk in the community for how bad it is, so I just would not recommend running it. This puts Nia into the C tier with a total of 6 points, which makes me really sad because I love this character. Moving on to Laurie Strode, our first DLC character that requires you to actually spend money on the game. Her first perk is Decisive Strike, which I'm sure all of you know what that does, but if you don't, it activates for 60 seconds after being unhooked, and if the killer downs you and picks you up within those 60 seconds, then you get a skill check, and if you hit the skill check, you escape from the killer's grasp and essentially get a second chance at life. However, it deactivates once you use it once. It deactivates prematurely if you do any sort of conspicuous action, which is anything that progresses the game, such as doing a gen, healing a survivor, working on a totem, and this disables it for the remainder of the trial. So this perk is purely made for being tunneled, and for what it's trying to be, it's a great perk. I'm going to give this a score of 4. I know a lot of people that would give it a 5, but I just don't think it's at that 5 level anymore. The likelihood of you being hardcore tunneled to make this perk useful is not actually as high as you may think, and even if it is, the killer has to still down you and pick you up within 60 seconds, which they could just slug you, or there's so many situations where this perk will just be completely useless, but it's just one of those things where it's a nice thing to have in your pocket on the off chance that it does happen. I do think there is a better anti-tunnel perk than this one, which we'll get to later in the video, but overall, Decisive Strike is still a solid perk and is an easy perk to just put in your build and forget about it. Her next 2 perks are absolutely terrible. I'm giving them both a 1. The first one is Object of Obsession, which makes it so that you can see the killer's aura when the killer can see your aura, and during this time, you have a 6% faster cleansing, healing, or repairing speed, which is nothing. Like, that does literally nothing. And then it also reveals the killer to you for 3 seconds every 30 seconds, in which the killer can also see your aura. It is just a terrible perk. I would say the most useful effect of this perk is seeing whether or not the killer has Lethal Pursuer, or maybe some other perks like Barbecue and Chili or something. But if you have a little bit of a keen eye, you can figure that out without using this perk. So it's just not worth it, especially because the killer can see your aura a lot of the time. And then her other perk is Soul Survivor, which is god awful. It's one of those perks that buffs you when you're the only survivor left. Any single one of those perks is going to be bad because you should never have a perk that requires other survivors to be dead to activate. Plus, it essentially makes it so that for every survivor that's dead, you get an increasing radius of being immune to aura reading abilities. So for 1, that's not even that good of an effect. And 2, a killer might not even run aura reading abilities, so then this perk would be completely useless anyway. And then the second part of this perk is, again, when you're the last survivor standing, your repair speed is increased by 75%, and your gate/hatch opening speeds are increased by 50%. The repair speed isn't exactly useful because you're the last survivor alive anyway, and the gate opening speed is somewhat decent, I guess, especially if the killer does not have line of sight on both doors. So if you're on an indoor map, for example, but I feel like in most situations where you're in that kind of 50-50 exit gate situation, if the gates are close enough, you would have lost it anyway. And if the gates are far enough, you would have won it anyway. And this perk wouldn't really affect it regardless. It's just not worth running at all. Like there's so many perks that would just help your team avoid dying in general, which is a much better situation than waiting for yourself to be the last person alive. It's very contradictory as a perk, and it's definitely getting a 1. And I don't think anyone would argue with me about that because it is a god awful. So that places Laurie in the C tier with a total of 6 points. However, I'm going to bump her all the way up to the bottom of A tier because I think Decisive Strike is definitely worth getting. I think it's a great perk for all skill levels, and it's just a nice kind of insurance to have if you're being tunneled. But I don't think it's so important that it needs to be S tier. Moving on to Ace Visconti. His first perk is Ace in the Hole, which makes it so that when you get an item out of a chest, you are guaranteed to get one add-on that is of purple rarity or lower, and then there's a 50% chance that you get a second add-on that's either yellow or brown. And then it has this cute little effect that allows you to keep any of the add-ons that your item has equipped upon escaping. But with the blood point economy nowadays, that's like low-key useless. I'm gonna give this perk a whopping 1 point. Chests are extremely bad nowadays because you can get blood points so easily that every single person can bring pretty much an iridescent add-on every single game if they really wanted to. So there's just not really a point in bringing this perk when you could just bring your own item and not have to gamble on whether or not it'll have a decent add-on or a decent item even. I really hope that they buff chest related things just in general because it's a very fun thing to use. I just wish they were a little bit more useful, especially this perk. Like I could see it being useful if it guarantees you an iridescent add-on for like the first chest that you search, and then it has a 50% chance of a purple add-on or below. That would actually be kind of cool because then maybe you get a med kit with a syringe, which can completely change the tide of the game. But as of its current state right now, it is god awful. His second perk is Open-Handed, which in my opinion is only useful with one other perk in the game. This perk increases the radius of all aura reading abilities by 16 meters, and there's only one thing that this is useful with, and that is Kindred. If you don't know, Kindred makes it so that you can see the aura of the killer if they're near a hooked survivor, and I believe Open-Handed doubles the distance that you can see the aura of the killer. So it gives you these insane wall hacks, which is especially useful on indoor maps, but I'm still gonna give this perk a 2 because it's just not useful for pretty much every other aura reading perk in the game. But when you run Open-Handed with Kindred, oh my god, it is so good. Like it's unironically one of the best perk combinations in the game. And then his last perk is Up the Ante, which is terrible. It's probably the top 5 worst perks in the game. All it does is it increases your self-unhook attempt chance by 3% per survivor that is alive. So you have a 9% better chance to self-unhook, which obviously, if you use your brain for more than 2 seconds, is nothing. Like it does nothing. The only time this is useful is if you have a 4-man who's all using Up the Ante and all using Vigo's Jar of Salty Lips, and everyone is running Slippery Meat. In this case, you're basically guaranteed to unhook yourself, which can be very useful, but you have to dedicate an entire team and an entire build for every single survivor to make this work. So it's just not worth, like this perk is awful. This places Ace in our first D tier slot with a total of 4 perks. He is terrible. Just don't buy him. There are only 2 reasons why I think you should get Ace. One is because he's the quietest character in the game. So if you don't want to run Iron Will, he's still very, very quiet, which almost gives you like an additional 5th perk slot where it's like kind of a half Iron Will. And the only other reason is if you're going to use Kindred and Open-Handed, because that perk combination is very good and very, very fun to use. But otherwise, avoid him like the plague. He's terrible. All right, moving on to Bill. His first perk is Borrowed Time, which just extends the duration of the endurance and the haste effect after you unhook a survivor by 10 seconds. This perk isn't terrible to guarantee the safety of the person you just unhooked. I just feel like there's so many other anti-tunnel perks that would be worth running over this one. And honestly, I don't really have that much else to say about it. Like, yes, it's helpful if a very specific survivor is being hardcore tunneled, and it's a good way to kind of deter the killer from tunneling that survivor. I just don't think this perk is really worth a perk slot anymore, so I'm gonna give it a 2. His next perk is Left Behind, which is getting a 1, just like Soul Survivor, because it's another perk that activates when you're the last survivor alive. This one makes it so that when you are that last person, you can see the aura of the hatch within 32 meters. I feel like this perk is only used for those challenges where you have to find the hatch and escape, but in general, this perk is just not worth running. Like, if you really need to find the hatch, bring a different perk and then just bring a map that can track a hatch. And then his last perk is Unbreakable, which is absolutely an S tier perk. It lets you fully recover from the dying state once per trial, and it also increases your recovery speed by 35%. So it's a phenomenal anti-slug perk, and although a majority of the games that you actually have this on, you won't get value out of it, this perk can single-handedly win you the game when you do get value out of it, and I think that's definitely worth giving it a 5 for. Even without being able to recover yourself fully, it's still good for that 35% extra recovery speed because you can get out of slugging situations way quicker than you could have otherwise. Plus, this perk pairs well with some other synergies that are kind of OP as well. So for example, if you use like the power struggle flip-flop build, Unbreakable is fantastic in that. But yeah, like this perk is great and is one of those perks that's so good that killers have to play around it even if they don't know that you have it. So that gives Bill a total of 8 points, throwing him in the A tier. I'm gonna put him at the top of the A tier for now, but I may bump him up to S because I do think that Unbreakable is one of the most important perks in the game. All right, moving on to Feng Min. Her first perk is Alert, which is one of the most underrated perks in the game, although I feel like this sentiment has been changing over time because everyone says that it's an underrated perk. I'm gonna give it a score of 4, which may be surprising for a lot of you, but I just think it gives you so much good information, especially if you're a solo queue player. This perk reveals the aura of the killer for 5 seconds every single time they do a break or damage action. So if they kick a gen, or if they kick a door, or if they break a pallet, you see where they are for 5 seconds. So not only is this good for like the general basic information of knowing where the killer is and where the survivor is chasing, it also gives you so much information on what things they've broken. And if you're a really good survivor, Alert will tell you exactly which parts of the map that you should avoid and which parts of the map that you need to go to during a chase. And obviously not having this information of what things are broken can make you accidentally run into a dead zone. Her next perk is Lithe, which is one of the best exhaustion perks in the game in my opinion, because it's so brain dead to use. Like you don't have to think about even having it on. You just vault a window and you get speed. So I think this is probably the best exhaustion perk if you don't want to think about having an exhaustion perk. So it's 100% getting a 5. You just fast vault a window or a pallet and then you get a 3-second sprint burst and then it makes you exhausted for 40 seconds. But also this perk pairs really well with other things such as Dance With Me and Quick and Quiet. That perk combination is absolutely insane, especially on indoor maps. So if you're not very good at getting chased, I would highly recommend getting that build, because if you're able to use that build to its fullest potential and you're able to break line of sight and stuff, you can lose the killer super easily. So yeah, Lithe is undoubtedly getting a 5, one of the better exhaustion perks in the game for sure. And her last perk is Technician, which is getting a 1. I don't think anyone would argue with that. It's really good for the first like 30 hours of playing the game. It reduces the audible range of your repair noises by 8 meters, which doesn't do much, although it is more useful than you may think. But the main part of this perk is that if you miss a skill check, it doesn't give a loud noise notification to the killer. So it's good for like the first 10 to 20 hours of this game, but skill checks are really not that hard. So it's just really not worth running a perk slot just to avoid missing skill checks. Plus it makes the regression you get from missing skill checks even worse, because for some reason this perk needed a downside. So it's just really useless once you have a little bit of experience with skill checks. Overall, that brings her to a total of 10 points, putting her in the S tier. All right, moving on to David. David's first perk is Dead Hard, and in my opinion, this perk is so overrated now. I think people just got so comfortable with using this perk that they just don't want to let go of it, but it's just not good anymore. I mean, it is good. It's just so much worse than other exhaustion perks. This makes it so that when you're unhooked, it activates, and then you can press a button to give yourself endurance for half of a second, and then it makes you exhausted for 40 seconds. So yes, this is still a great exhaustion perk. It basically gives you a second chance at life if you're able to use it properly, but the fact that you're only able to get it twice in a match now, unless a teammate is using the new Shoulder the Burden perk, it's just really not as good as people say, in my opinion. I'm still gonna give it a 4 because it is a great perk overall. Like, don't get me wrong, I just really don't feel like it compares to other exhaustion perks anymore. The next perk is No Mither. I don't think I need to really explain this one. This is getting a 1, but it's meant to be a meme perk, so it is honestly kind of a fun challenge. It just makes you permanently injured for the entire game, but then you don't leave any pools of blood. You become 75% quieter when you're on the ground. Your recovery speed is increased by 25%, and you're able to pick yourself up whenever you want. Unfortunately, being injured the entire game just isn't worth it at all, but it is a funny meme perk and can be used for some interesting synergy like Plot Twist No Mither, which can be used to get rid of like the killer's corrupt intervention or something. So that's always hilarious. Unless they change that. I feel like I remember them changing that. I don't know. Let me know in the comments. And last but not least, he has We're Gonna Live Forever, which is a very underrated perk. I think this perk is fantastic. It doubles your healing speed for survivors that are on the ground. So it's a very good anti-slugging perk. And on top of that, it doesn't have any prerequisites anymore for the endurance. So if you do heal someone back from the dying state, they'll gain endurance for 10 seconds. So this can be very clutch if a survivor is 99 and you're about to go down. You know how when you're 99, there's some survivors that'll pick you up so that the killer hits you instead of them because they're about to die? Well, this perk allows them to do that, but both of you get out of the situation as well, which can be very strong in the right situation. Overall, I'm going to give this perk a 3 though, because although it's a very useful perk, I do think that other anti-slugging perks are just better than this, but in general, this perk is a lot more useful than you may think. Overall, this gives David a score of 8, putting him into the A tier. I'm going to honestly put him above Dwight, I think. Actually, I'm going to put Laurie above Dwight too, even though Dwight has more points technically. I think DS is way worth getting more than all of Dwight's perks. Okay, moving on to Quentin. Quentin's first perk is Pharmacy, which activates when you're injured, and it increases the speed of unlocking chests by 80%, so it almost doubles your speed, and it it reduces the hearing range of you unlocking chests by 8 meters, and then it guarantees a green medkit. Unfortunately, this perk became so much more useless after they reworked the medkits to where they just don't really self-heal as well. This used to be a very, very underrated perk because the green medkit used to be the best medkit in the game because it was the fastest to self-heal. But now that every medkit doesn't have any unique characteristics, which is really depressing, this perk is just not really worth running. I'm still going to give it a 2 because I do think that searching chests for a medkit can be very useful in the right hands, but I really just don't think it's worth the perk slot, and I think you'd be better off just bringing in a medkit and then bringing in a different perk. His next perk is Vigil, which increases the recovery rate of a ton of different status effects by 30%, plus it affects other survivors who are close to you as well. Obviously, the biggest status effect that this perk is used for is for exhaustion, so if you're pairing Vigil with something like Sprint Burst, you're able to get Sprint Burst back way more often than you would normally would, which is very, very strong, especially if you're a really good survivor who walks during chase, but it's honestly pretty useful for other status effects as well. Like for example, with the new Shoulder the Burden perk that makes you exposed for, I think it's a full minute, this will reduce that by almost 20 seconds, so it makes that perk a lot better. And there's like very niche situations where this perk is extremely good, like if you're going against a clown, this perk counters the hindered status effect that you get from his bottles very, very well, and it also helps counter various other perks, which can be quite useful, but obviously it depends on RNG of what the killer's using. I'm still going to give this a 3 though, purely for the fact that you can use this with exhaustion to get exhaustion perks back way quicker, and then you just have the added bonus of it affecting other status effects as well. And his last perk is Wake Up. Wake Up is a very good perk if you're doing comp, but in public matches, it's just not worth a perk slot at all. All it does is it shows you the auras of exit gate switches, and then it shows your aura to other survivors if you're working on an exit gate, and then it increases your exit gate opening speed by 25%. So it's good to get that extra 25% speed in a really coordinated group of friends, but in a majority of situations, the 25% speed isn't actually going to be worth it anyway, especially against most killers in public matches, so I just don't think this perk is really worth running. I'm going to give it a 2 though. I don't think it's bad enough to get a 1 because I do think there can be some value found in it in very specific situations, especially if you're in those situations where it's just you and the killer and it's a 1v1 and you're in the exit gate scenario where it's like a 50-50. This could definitely help you get out of that. Honestly, I could see the argument for this perk being a 1, but just purely from it being decent in comp from what I've heard, I'm going to give it a 2, which brings Quentin to a total of 7 points, placing him in the B tier. All right, moving on to Detective Tapp. His first perk is Detective's Hunch, which is extremely underrated. This perk reveals the auras of any chests, generators, or totems within 64 meters of your location every single time a generator is completed. It's a pretty decent information perk to show you exactly where you need to go next, especially if you're on an indoor map and you don't really know what generators have been completed. This perk has just unfortunately gotten worse as the meta has evolved, because I used to run this perk surprisingly a lot when we were in the Ruin Undying meta, because it was a great way to find totems without actively having to look for them, but not a lot of people use hex perks anymore. And honestly, this perk might be good with the new Thrill of the Hunt meta that's happening right now, or that was happening on the date of recording this video, but even just for seeing gens in indoor maps, it's a pretty decent information perk, so I'm going to give it a 3. His next perk is Stakeout. Stakeout gives you a token for every 15 seconds you are within the killer's terror radius while not being chased, up to a maximum of 4 tokens, and then if you ever hit a good skill check, it'll consume one of those tokens and give you an additional progression bonus of 1%. So it basically just turns your good skill checks into greats. It's not terrible, and you can pair it with some stuff like Hyperfocus or Fogwise to get more use out of those perks, but in general, I just don't really think it's worth running because I don't think it really does enough to make it worth the perk slot. I'm still going to give it a 2 though, just purely based on the synergies that can be used with it, but in general, I wouldn't really recommend this perk. And last but not least, he has Tenacity, which increases your crawling speed by 50% and gives you the ability to crawl and recover at the same time, while also reducing your sounds by 75% when you're on the ground. So it's a good anti-slugging perk, but it's pretty much only used if you're doing like the power struggle flip-flop build. So while it can be useful in very specific situations, there's just way better anti-slugging perks out there. So I'm going to give this a 2, which brings Tapp to a total of 7 points, placing him in the B tier. All right, moving on to one of the fan favorites, Kate Denson. Her first perk is Boil Over, which increases the strength of your struggling effects when you're on the killer's shoulders by 80%. So this doesn't mean you wiggle out faster, it just means you wiggle out harder, so the killer sways side to side harder, getting them stuck on doorways and such. It also removes the auras of any hooks within 16 meters of the killer, which is great if the killer's kind of new and doesn't really know hook spawns, or if they're on an indoor map, they might go to a further hook, which gives you more of a chance to get off the shoulders. And the last part of this perk, which is the best part of this perk, is that it grants you 1/3 of your wiggle progression upon landing if the killer drops from a height. So it just gives you a decent increase to your wiggle progression if they fall from a height, but a lot of the times this fall is going to happen early in your wiggle, so it's not actually going to give you that much progression since it's only 33% of what you currently have. So overall, I'm going to give this perk a 2. It can be pretty useful on very specific parts of very specific maps, but in general, it's just kind of mediocre. Her next perk though is Dance With Me, which is so good with that perk combination I was talking about earlier with Lithe and Quick and Quiet, but pretty much besides that, it's just not worth running. This makes it so that when you fast fall, it removes your scratch marks for 3 seconds and then goes on cooldown for 20 seconds. So with the Lithe and Quick and Quiet thing, you can use Lithe and have an insane speed burst while leaving no scratch marks. So it's a very easy way to lose the killer. But unfortunately, that's like the only good synergy with this perk. So it's just not very versatile, which is why I'm giving it a 3. And lastly, Windows of Opportunity. This is obviously getting a 5. The fact that it doesn't have a cooldown anymore just makes this perk a very, very useful information perk. It shows you the auras of all breakable walls, pallets, and windows within 32 meters of your location, which is really good for new players so that you can learn the loops and learn how they spawn. And it's really good for other players so that they know which pallets have been thrown, which pallets have spawned, which windows have spawned, without actually having to see the loop. But it's especially good for very high tier players that have extensive game knowledge, so you can know exactly how to run loops. So for example, with the Midwich God window, if it spawns on the top story of one side of the map and you're able to see that with Windows of Opportunity, you know that on the opposite side of the map, the God window will be on the bottom floor. So little things like that you learn over time makes this an extremely valuable perk that's versatile and useful in every single game, and there's literally no downside to running it. This brings Kate to a total of 10 points, placing her in the S tier, but I am going to put her above Feng because I do feel that Windows of Opportunity is a lot more versatile for all skill levels. Moving on to Adam, his first perk is Autodidact. I love this perk. This is probably one of the most fun perks in the game, and they buffed it relatively recently, so it's not as like awful as it once was. It's still such a gamble, but basically this perk makes it so that every time you hit a skill check while healing another survivor without a medkit, you get a token up to a maximum of 5 tokens, and each token increases your healing progression by 15%, but you start with negative 15% progression. So the first skill check that you hit will actually decrease your progression by 15%, but after that, it'll obviously go to 0, and then it'll go to 15%, and then it'll go to 30%, all the way up to 60% at 5 tokens, which just, it's almost like an insta heal. It's great. I really love this perk. I don't think it's like amazing by any means. I'm still gonna give it a score of a 3, but it is so fun. Like, I love this perk. If you've ever used this perk, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like, you don't get too much use out of it in some games, but on the games you do get use out of it, you feel like an absolute god, and it's so much fun. His next perk is Deliverance, which is one of the strongest survivor perks in the game, and not a lot of people run it, which is very, very strange in my opinion. It makes it so that you have to get a safe unhook to activate this perk, but then once you do that, you can self-unhook yourself on your first hook stage for completely free, and then it makes you broken for 1 minute. So assuming you're able to get a safe unhook before you're hooked, this perk just deletes killer's pressure. Like, the fact that another survivor doesn't have to come get you off of the hook is a very, very strong effect, which saves a ton of time and increases a ton of efficiency, especially if the killer took the time to hook you in the basement and was kind of proxy camping. If you have this perk and like a couple anti-tunnel perks like DS or something, it is extremely good to just destroy that killer's pressure. Or in situations where the killer has a ton of survivors hooked right near each other, you can use this perk to pull the killer away from you because they think you just got unhooked, while the other survivor actually goes for the real unhook. Like, there's so many situations where this is useful, and I'm surprised it's not used as much as it is because I'm definitely giving this a score of a 5, one of the best perks in the game. And then there's Diversion. This perk is getting a 1. It is extremely useless, but it is so much fun. Like, it is hilarious. This is the Pebble perk where after being inside of the killer's tear radius for 20 seconds, it activates, and you can crouch and press a button to throw a pebble, which creates a fake loud noise notification and fake scratch marks 20 meters away from you in the direction that you're looking. This effect is not good, but it's so funny when it actually works because the killer never really expects people to be running this perk. So if you want a really fun perk to just mess around with the killer, this is a great one to get, but in terms of practicality, it's not actually good at all. But this places Adam in the S tier with 9 points. I am going to put him at the bottom of S tier, but I do think this is actually worth it just for Deliverance alone and the fact that he has 2 very, very fun perks. Okay, moving on to Jeff. His first perk is Aftercare, which is kind of the like ugly stepchild of the teammate aura rating perks. It makes it so that every time you heal someone, or they heal you, or you unhook someone, or they unhook you, their aura becomes permanently revealed to you until you're unhooked. And it also goes both ways, so they can also see your aura. I do think people sleep on this perk. Like, it's a lot better than you may think, but unfortunately it just has so many weird prerequisites, and the fact that it can get disabled so easily just makes this perk not as reliable as other perks like Empathy or Bond. Like, granted, you do get the nice effect of A, the aura reading going both ways so the survivors can see you as well, and B, being able to see survivors anywhere on the map while they're injured or healthy. Like, those are definitely nice effects, but just the fact that it can get disabled when you get hooked so easily and you have to rebuild it up makes this perk just not as good as the other ones. I'm still going to give this perk a 3 though, because it can give you some very valuable information, and the fact that it gives the other teammates information on you as well is a really nice touch. His next perk is Breakdown. Again, another very underrated perk in my opinion, but I'm still gonna give it a 2 just because it's not realistically that useful in a lot of situations. But there are some instances on some maps where this perk is a godsend and is very, very OP. This makes it so that when you're unhooked, you can see the killer's aura for 6 seconds, and it also breaks the hook for 3 minutes. So as I'm sure you can imagine, on maps that have very sparse hook spawns, if you're able to break a hook for 3 minutes, that can actually be very useful. The only issue is that the killer can easily put you into a slugging situation, and if you don't have the right tools equipped for that, then it's just really not worth running this perk. But if you're able to avoid a slugging situation, and if you're able to break some very, very important perks, it can be surprisingly useful. And it's also somewhat decent because killers will try to put you on Scourge hooks, and since Pain Res is the most popular killer perk in the game right now, you can break their Scourge hook for 3 minutes, which can be very useful. So honestly, I could see an argument for this perk being a 3, but I'm still going to give it a 2 just because I feel like the usefulness that you can get out of this perk is a little bit too situational. And lastly, Distortion. I'm going to give this perk a 3. It's a solid stealth perk. You start the trial with 1 token, and if the killer attempts to read your aura, it consumes that token and applies the following effects for 12 seconds. And for the next 12 seconds, your aura cannot be read and you don't leave any scratch marks. So it's a great counter to Lethal Pursuer because obviously they can't see your aura immediately when the game starts. And it's a great perk to other aura reading perks as well, but you have to be in chase for 15 seconds to recharge a token, and you can only have a maximum of 2 tokens. But honestly, 15 seconds in chase isn't really that bad unless you're terrible at Survivor. So overall, if you hate aura reading perks for some reason, you can use this perk pretty effectively to avoid the killer. This brings Jeff total to 8, putting him in the A tier, and I'm going to put him at the bottom of the A tier because I do feel like all of the other A tier survivors have better perks than him. All right, next up on the list, we have Jane. Jane's first perk is Head On, which is one of the most fun exhaustion perks in the game. If you hide in a locker for 3 seconds, Head On activates, and then if you fast fall out of a locker, you can stun the killer if they're within range, and then you become exhausted for 40 seconds. It is an extremely fun perk to use because it's so funny stunning the killer, and you can do things with like flashbang and stuff to just completely bully the killer. And if you're in a really coordinated group of friends, that killer is just not going to have a good time, and it's going to be great. But I do think that in practicality, like if you're ignoring the fun parts of this perk is not actually good. If you're against a competent killer, this perk will cause you more harm than it does good because they can easily tell when they're being baited into a head-on stun, and they could just bait you and then get a free hit. But if you're against a killer who is not very aware of their surroundings, you can get so many stuns with this perk and it's hilarious. But because it's not actually that useful in terms of practicality, I am going to give it a 2. However, if you're wanting to have a really fun time with friends or even just solo, I would highly recommend getting this perk as long as you have Quick and Quiet, because you kind of have to have Quick and Quiet with this perk. Our next perk is Poised. This would have had a score of 1, but luckily got buffed recently, and now it's honestly not terrible. It's still pretty bad, but it's not as bad as it used to be. Now, whenever a gen is completed, you don't leave scratch marks for the next 14 seconds, but also it has this new effect where the first time you start to repair any generator, you can see the aura of the killer for 6 seconds. So this gives you decent information throughout the match, but it gives you very, very useful information at the start of the match, right when you get on a generator, because A, you can see where the killer spawned, you can see where they're going, and you can see what killer they are. Or you can see that they don't have an aura, so you know it's a stealth killer. These 4 bits of information are very useful at the start of the match. It's almost like your own version of Lethal Pursuer. So I am going to give it a score of 2, but it's way better than it used to be. And her last perk is Solidarity, which also recently got buffed and is also not as bad as it used to be. If you're ever healing someone without a med kit, it'll also passively heal you at 70% of the progression. So if, for example, you unhook someone while you're injured and you heal them to full, then they only have to heal you for like a couple seconds to finish your heal. So it's a pretty decent way to save time on healing, but unfortunately there's going to be so many situations where you're just not injured, so you don't get any effect out of it, or it's more worth it for the other survivor to heal you first because you're in a very dire situation where you have to be alive for whatever reason. So I'm still going to give this perk a 2, but with the new buff, I could honestly see an argument for it being bumped up to a 3. But overall, this gives Jane a total of 6 points, which places her in the C tier. I am going to place her below Nia though, because Nia has an exhaustion perk that is actually useful, and I think that's definitely worth getting over Head On. Okay, moving on to Ash. Ash's first perk is Buckle Up, which unfortunately got nerfed kind of into the ground. When you're healing a survivor from the dying state, the aura of the killer is revealed to the both of you, so you know exactly where they are. And then once you complete the heal, the person you just picked up loses their scratch marks and becomes 50% faster for 5 seconds. So it's like a decent perk for guaranteeing the safety of the person you just picked up, because a 50% haste for 5 seconds is really, really good. But in a lot of situations, it'd be more useful to have something that like gives you endurance, such as We're Gonna Live Forever, because then they can take a hit for you and then you both get out of the situation. Whereas this only makes one person get out of the situation, and then the killer, if they're assuming they're coming back, can just down you. So yes, it's great to protect one person, but it doesn't really give you the potential of protecting both of you unless you pair it with other perks like Dead Hard or something, or if you have your sprint Sprint Burst 99 or something. So I think this perk is just a little bit too niche, so I'm going to give it a score of 2. Then he has Flip Flop, which converts your recovery rate to wiggle progression, albeit at a 50% speed. So if you're able to get to almost maximum recovery, then if the killer picks you up, you'll be instantly almost halfway done with your wiggle bar. Now this perk alone is almost useless. Like it's really not that useful, but if you pair it with a build like Power Struggle and Unbreakable, it could genuinely be uncounterable if you have a friend nearby. We haven't really talked about Power Struggle yet because that's on Elodie, which is later in the video, but Power Struggle makes it so that if you're above 15% wiggle progression and the killer walks through a pallet, you could throw the pallet down yourself, instantly getting off their shoulders. So with Flip Flop, if you die on a pallet and you have a friend nearby, if the killer picks you up instantly, then your friend can go pallet save you. But if the killer tries to chase your friend, then it gives you enough time to reach that 15% wiggle threshold using Flip Flop, which means that the killer can now no longer pick you up because you'll just stun them with the pallet. I will always and forever be shocked that this perk combination is not used more often because it is genuinely uncounterable in so many situations. So I'm going to give this perk a 3 because you do have to like build an entire build around it because it's not useful alone, but when you do, it can be so good. And lastly, he has Medal of Man, which activates after you get 2 protection hits. And after that, if you're injured and the killer hits you, you won't actually go down, and instead you basically get the effect of endurance, but you don't actually get put into deep wound when you're hit. But that has this weird downside where when you heal back to full health, the killer can see your aura whenever you're 16 meters away from them, and then it deactivates when you're down. I don't really understand why this perk has a downside. Like the upside isn't even that good to begin with. Actively try to get protection hits to activate this perk. So I feel like they could completely remove the downside. Although I will say that using this perk with Object of Obsession would actually be kind of cool. I don't think I've ever seen anyone do that. But theoretically, if you're able to get this part of the perk active, you could have permanent wall hacks on the killer as long as they're 16 meters away from you. It just requires a lot of setup, but I feel like that might actually be kind of interesting. Overall though, this perk has too many prerequisites to get the ability. So I'm going to give it a 2 because a lot of times you'll just throw your game trying to get protection hits and it just is more detrimental than it is useful. This brings Ash to a total of 7 points, placing him in the B tier. I think I am going to put him above Tapp and above Quentin just purely for the fact that you can get Flip Flop, and Flip Flop is really fun in that perk build. So I think that's worth it over the other perks that Quentin and Tapp have. Next up, we got Nancy, and her first perk is Better Together. If you're ever repairing a gen, the aura of the gen will be highlighted in yellow to all other survivors if they're within 32 meters of you. So it basically tells you what gen you're working on. And then if the killer downs a survivor while you're repairing a gen, you can see the auras of every other survivor for 10 seconds. So it's a neat little information perk. It tells survivors where you are, so if they're in chase, they won't go to your gen, hopefully. And being able to see all other survivors for 10 seconds if they go down while you're working on a gen is somewhat useful to know what people are doing. So this perk is like decent if you're solo queuing and need information. I just feel like there's so many other better solo queue information perks out there that I just don't think this perk is necessarily worth running. So I'm going to give this a score of 2. Her next perk is Fixated, which increases your walking speed by 20% and lets you see your own scratch marks, which honestly isn't that useful. This perk is very bad for average survivors or below and very good for really good survivors. It's bad for average survivors and below because if you're using this perk for stealth, it is just going to ruin your games. Like you should not be using this perk for stealth. That's not what it's intended for. If you're using this perk for stealth and you're walking around the entire map, especially if you're using Sprint Burst and you're using this to just walk around to gain your Sprint Burst back, I promise you that will make you lose so many more games. You'd be way better off not running this perk. But once you become a really good survivor, this perk does 2 things that are extremely helpful when you use this perk to walk in chase. 1, you get your exhaustion back in chase, obviously. So that's very useful, especially if you're using Sprint Burst. So that's very useful, obviously, because you can extend chases if you're able to get your exhaustion perk back faster. But 2, and most importantly, you can break chase while still being in chase because the game thinks that if you're walking, you're no longer in chase. So this allows you to vault the same window more than 3 times while you're still in chase, which is especially useful on Shack because if you're able to walk and break line of sight, you lose chase, which lets you vault the window potentially 4 or even 5 times before it gets blocked. So it can extend chases way more if you're able to use it properly. But because this perk is relatively difficult to use if you're not like a super high experienced survivor, I am going to give it a total of 3 points. And her last perk is Inner Strength. Inner Strength activates when you cleanse a totem. And if you're ever injured, if you go into a locker for 8 seconds, it'll automatically heal you for 1 health save. This is a decent middle of the road healing perk that's especially useful if you're going against a hex build because, you know, you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. But the problem with this perk right now is the fact that one of the strongest killer combinations is Hex Pentimento and Hex Plaything, which buffs the killer if you're cleansing their hex totems. So if you're trying to get use out of this perk, you're actually just kind of making it harder for yourself to win the game. And if you're actively going out of your way to search for totems, then you're just wasting a lot of time and you'd just be better off using that perk slot for something else. But assuming that the killer is not using Pentimento and assuming you're passively looking for totems, meaning that you cleanse it if you just find it while walking by, instead of actively going out of your way to find totems, instead of like doing gens or healing or something, then this perk perk can be pretty solid and can give you some really nice healing. But I am going to give it a 3 because it is relatively situational and can have some huge detriments if you go against specific builds. This brings Nancy to a total of 8 points, putting her in the A tier, but I am going to put her above Jeff because I do think that Fixated and Inner Strength are actually pretty solid. All right, moving on to Steve. Steve's first perk is Babysitter. Whenever you unhook a survivor, the aura of the killer is revealed to you for 8 seconds, and then the person you unhooked doesn't leave scratch marks or blood for 30 seconds, and it also increases the haste that they get when they're unhooked by 10%. So it's a decent little perk for making sure that the person you unhooked is safe and is able to get away safely. But I just feel like this perk is kind of contradictory because if you're unhooking a survivor and the killer is near you and they're going to tunnel the survivor, they're going to be able to see the survivor anyway. So the scratch marks and pools of blood being hidden won't be that big of a deal because the killer could just see them, like they could just look at them with their eyes. And then if you're unhooking not near the killer, then the killer's probably not going to be tunneling and chasing that survivor anyway. So then the perk doesn't really matter. Does that make sense? So I'm going to give this perk a 2 because I think it can be useful in very specific situations if the survivor is being tunneled, but it just has a weird like contradictory nature about it that just makes it kind of awkward to use. His next perk is Camaraderie. I have a hard time ranking this perk because it's very good at higher levels, but I just feel like Reassurance, which is a perk that we'll talk about later, is just a overall better version of this perk. Camaraderie makes it so that if you're on the struggle phase on the hook, your timer will be paused for 34 seconds if a survivor comes within 16 meters of your hook. So I'll talk about the pros before I talk about the cons. The pros are that if the killer is camping or proxy camping, this can give you and your teammates a lot more time to reset, which can guarantee an escape sometimes or guarantee that that person gets out of the unhook safely and can guarantee that you get the unhook without having to 1-for-1. But of course, this requires more than one person and requires quite a bit of good coordination. So in those situations, it can be pretty useful. It's also pretty useful if you're solo queuing because a lot of solo queue survivors will be scared to unhook if the killer's nearby. So getting that additional 34 seconds can save you from dying on first hook, which happens way more frequently than it should. But I just don't really see why you'd use this perk when Reassurance exists, which basically does the same thing, but you can use it twice instead of once, and you can use it on every survivor. Plus it also pauses the skill checks when they're on the struggle phase. So it just has like so many more upsides and is so much more consistent. It just kind of makes Camaraderie a little bit useless in my opinion. So I'm going to give it a total of 2 points. And last but not least, he has Second Wind, which activates when you heal another survivor for the equivalent of 1 full health state. And the next time you're unhooked, you become broken for 20 seconds, but then after those 20 seconds, you are instantly healed. Very, very underrated perk and kind of a fun perk, to be honest. It's pretty nice for efficiency because if you're able to heal someone and you get unhooked and the killer's not chasing you, you don't have to take that time getting healed. So you can go work on a gen or you can go do something productive without having to do the healing time. But it's also good even if you are being tunneled because if you're able to survive for 20 seconds, then it just extends your chase so much more. So it's a pretty solid perk overall. I'm going to give it a score of 3, which brings the total of Steve to 7 points, placing him in the B tier. Next up, we got Yui. Her first perk is Any Means Necessary, which allows you to pick up dropped pallets if they're not broken, and it shows you the auras of any pallets that are dropped anywhere on the map. This is a fun and niche meme perk to get more uses out of pallets, but a majority of the time the killer will be breaking pallets anyway, or it's a killer that kind of ignores pallets like Nurse or Huntress or something. So I'm going to give this a 2. I think it can be useful in very, very specific situations, but overall it's just not very versatile. Her next perk is Breakout. This activates when you're within 5 meters of a killer that's carrying another survivor, and you become 7% faster, and you increase the wiggling speed of the other survivor that's on the shoulders by 25%. So it's a pretty bad perk on its own, but if you synergize it with some sort of sabotage build, you can make it very difficult for killers to hook the survivors, especially if you have more than one person taking hits. So there are some really clutch situations that you can get with this, where you're trying to save someone that's on death hook and you're able to and everybody escapes. In those moments, Breakout feels so good, but the odds of being in those situations are relatively rare, and being able to get good value out of this perk consistently is difficult. So I'm going to give it a 2. But then Yui has Lucky Break, and I am very surprised that not more people use this. Lucky Break makes it so that when you get injured, you don't leave any pools of blood or scratch marks for a maximum of 60 seconds. And then for every second spent healing another survivor, it recharges 1 second for this effect. And you can pause the timer if you heal yourself. Super, super underappreciated perk that can make you lose the killer very easily, especially if you have certain exhaustion perks. So if you don't like being chased, Lucky Break is really useful, especially if you're on an indoor map. But the downside to this perk is the fact that you kind of have to run a med kit because otherwise you're just going to use up all of the 60 seconds before you can even get healed sometimes, and that just makes the perk kind of useless. But in general, I'm going to give it a score of 4. I think it's a very solid perk, and I'm surprised that not many people use it. This brings Yui to a total of 8 points, placing her in the A tier, but I am going to put her all the way above Dwight because I do think that Lucky Break is better than all of the perks that you can get from these 3 other characters. Okay, moving on to Zarina. Her first perk is For the People, which lets you instantly heal someone at the expense of your own health state. So obviously you have to be healthy to activate this perk. perk. But if you're, for example, healing someone off the ground, you can instantly revive them and then you become broken for 60 seconds. This is a very fun perk and is honestly really good if you know how to use it properly. And it can be very helpful if you pair it with perks like Buckle Up or like We're Gonna Live Forever or like Soul Guard that activate when you pick someone up off the ground because you can activate them instantly. But it's also nice to just trade a health state for someone if they're injured and they're on death hook, for example, and you haven't been hooked a single time. Being able to instantly heal them to give them more protection can be very useful, especially on a coordinated team. So I'm going to give this perk a 4 because I think if you use it properly, it can completely change the tide of a match. And her next perk is Off the Record, which in my opinion is probably the best perk in the game, at least top 3. So it's absolutely getting a score of 5. This perk is insane. It's like 3 different perks put into one. After you get unhooked, it activates for 80 seconds. And for 80 seconds, you have the endurance status effect. Your aura cannot be red, and you don't make any grunts of pain when injured. So you get permanent distortion, you get permanent iron will, and you get permanent borrowed time for 80 seconds. It is insane. You do, however, lose the endurance if you perform a conspicuous action, but this is by far the best anti-tunnel perk in the game because, like, imagine a killer is tunneling you and you're able to loop them for a solid minute before they actually hit you. You still have endurance after that entire minute, so you won't go down. It's crazy. This perk is so good and is definitely the best anti-tunnel perk that we have. And even if you cancel the endurance because you're not being tunneled, you still get the effects of not having your aura red and not making any sounds when you're injured for almost a minute and a half after being unhooked, which can be extremely useful, especially if you want to use this aggressively to go for flashbang saves or flashlight saves or something. A phenomenal perk. And then her last perk is Red Herring, which is one of the worst perks in the entire game. This makes it so that if you repair a generator for 3 seconds, its aura is highlighted to you in yellow. And then if you enter a locker, that generator will make a fake loud noise notification for the killer. And then this perk goes on cooldown for 40 seconds. It is just not the setup required for this perk just to create a loud noise notification is just not worth it. So many killers ignore those anyway, and having to go out of your way to hit a generator that hasn't been worked on is just not worth it. It's just not worth the time. And if you use it on a generator that has progression, or if other teammates are working on it, then you're just detrimenting the team. Like, you're literally just making it worse for the team. So I'm giving this perk a 1. But even with that score of 1 on one of her perks, it still places Zarina in the S tier with a score of 10 points. And I'm going to put her above Kate because I think For the People and Off the Record are just such good perks. Moving on to Cheryl. This one makes me really sad because she has some very creative perks, but they're just so bad. Like, they're just awful. Her first perk is Blood Pact, which activates when either you or the obsession becomes injured. And when it's active, your auras are constantly revealed to one another. And then if you heal the obsession or if they heal you, both of you become 7% faster as long as you stay within 16 meters of one another. But if you leave those 16 meters, then it becomes disabled. But it also becomes disabled if you become the obsession. So it gives you a tiny bit of information and gives you some decent speed if you stay within 16 meters of one another. But it just requires so much setup for like not that great of an effect that it's just not worth running. And especially the fact that Power of 2 exists, which we'll talk about later in the video, which is basically just a better version of this perk overall that has worse numbers but can activate a lot more consistently. It just makes this perk a little bit obsolete. So I'm going to give this perk a 2. Her next perk is Repressed Alliance, which unfortunately just is very meta based. And it's just, I wish this perk was so much better than it was because it's such a cool and unique idea. This perk activates after you repair generators for a total of 45 seconds. And then you can press a button to make the entity block that gen for 30 seconds. But this perk ends up just being more of a detriment to yourself than it helps you. Like, yes, it can be good to prevent your gen from being popped or something, but you can't work on that gen for 30 seconds, which is insane. I almost feel like they should rework this perk to where for every second that you repair a generator, you can block the generator for that amount of seconds and you can activate it and deactivate it whenever you want, because this would at least give you some sort of control over this perk. It is definitely getting a score of 1. It is just not worth running at all. And her last perk is Soul Guard, which I'm going to give a score of a 2. It makes it so that when you're healed from the dying state, you get the endurance status effect for 8 seconds. And it also allows you to fully recover yourself from the dying state if you're cursed by a hex totem. But unfortunately, hex builds are not very common besides the Thrill of the Hunt meta that's happening right now. But I have a feeling that's going to get changed very quickly. So you never really have this part of the effect, but getting endurance after being healed is relatively nice, especially if you're playing with a friend and you're doing, you know, the For the People Soul Guard thing. Then it can be a very, very fun perk. But in general, it's just kind of mediocre. So that's why it's getting a 2, which places Cheryl in the D tier, which is really sad because she's such a cool survivor with such unique and cool perks, but they're just not good enough, unfortunately. Next up, we have Felix. Felix's first perk is Built to Last, which allows you to essentially recharge an item when it's depleted as long as you hide in a locker for 12 seconds. And the first time you use it, it recharges your item to 99%. I hate that they did this. The fact that they did 99% makes me so mad because it means that you can't fully use a med kit to self-heal yourself, which is exactly why they did it too. Like, I know that's why they did it. And that just makes this perk so much worse. Like, it can be so much more useful if it recharged it fully the first use, because medkits are so much worse than they used to be now anyway. And then on the second recharge, it goes to 66%, and on the third, it goes to 33. So it's a decent perk. Like, you can get more use out of your items, and it's especially good if you're using like a really good toolbox or something. So overall, I'm going to give it a 3 because it can be useful with certain items, but on a lot of items, it's just not really worth using. His next perk is Desperate Measures, which increases your action speeds for healing and unhooking by 14% per each injured, hooked, or dying survivor. So this is just a reverse Thanatophobia. So if all 4 of you are injured, then your healing and unhooking speed is increased by 56%. It's a pretty mediocre healing perk, I would say. It's just that a majority of the time, there's only going to be like 1 or 2 people, maybe 3 that are activating this perk. So you're not actually getting that much value out of your healing, and it could just be very inconsistent. Like, there's just not really a point in using this perk when Botany Knowledge exists, which gives you just a blanket 50% healing speed, and you don't have to do anything. Like, there's no prerequisites at all. Obviously, this perk is good paired with that because you get even faster healing speeds, but alone, it's just not as good and just not very reliable nor consistent. And the fact that they removed hook grabs, so the killer can no longer grab you while you're unhooking a survivor, it just makes the unhooking speed just not as useful anymore. So I'm going to give this perk a 2. And his last perk, which is super simple, this is called Visionary, and it just shows you the auras of generators that are within 32 meters of your location, and then goes on cooldown for 16 seconds whenever a gen is completed. For some reason, I have no idea why. This downside is completely unnecessary because this perk is bad. Like, it's a 2. Like, I'm giving it a 2. Like, it's decent for beginners to kind of learn gen spawns, but once you've played every map once or twice, it's pretty easy to know where gens are spawning, and it's really not that difficult to find gens unless you're on an indoor map sometimes. But even indoor maps have the indicators like the blinking lights, or for the game, the metal doors that are closed means there's a gen right next to it. So if you know those things, Visionary is just not really worth it. So it's very much a beginner perk, but this brings Felix to a total of 7 points, placing him in the B tier, but I'm going to put him just at the bottom of B tier because I just don't think his perks are really worth getting early. The next survivor we have on our list is Elodie, and her first perk is Appraisal. You start the trial with 3 tokens, and you can use 1 token to perform the rummage action on an already unlocked chest to receive a second item from it. So you can unlock a chest, get 1 item, and then you can pick up that item and then rummage through the chest to get another item. And it increases your rummaging speed by 80%. So you can basically double the amount of items that you can get. But unfortunately, chests just aren't that good right now. Like, yes, it can give you a higher chance of getting a medkit, but that's pretty much the only use I could think of for this perk. I feel like this perk is only ever used for tome challenges, and that's pretty much it. So I'm going to give it a 2. It can be useful for the medkit thing, like I said, but besides that, there's just not really any reason to run this. Our second perk is Deception, which is a very fun perk, but unfortunately killers know about it now, so it doesn't really throw them off anymore. This perk allows you to interact with a locker, and it basically fakes the fact that you went into the locker, so it opens and closes it, and then it removes your scratch marks for 3 seconds, and then it goes on cooldown for 20 seconds. So if you're out of line of sight of the killer, you can potentially throw them off, but unfortunately killers just don't really fall for this anymore, which makes this perk kind of useless. So I'm going to give it a 2. I think it would be really cool if it activated the perks that require you to fast vault. So for example, if you have like Lithe and you activate Deception on a locker, you get that speed boost. That would be super interesting, but that might be a little too busted, to be honest. But it could make this perk a lot more useful, and they could just increase the cooldown on it. And her last perk is Power Struggle, which we kind of talked about before. It reveals the auras of pallets when you're in the dying state, and if you get to that 15% wiggle threshold and a killer goes through a pallet, you can throw the pallet, stunning the killer and escaping their grasp. I kind of glazed it earlier in the video because it's such a strong combination if you're playing with a friend and you're using the flip-flop Power Struggle build. So overall, I'm going to give this a total score of 4 points, which puts Elodie at a score of 8, placing her in the A tier, but I am going to put her all the way above Yui because I think that Power Struggle build is such a good build to have. And like I said earlier, it's uncounterable in a lot of situations. All right, moving on to Yunjin. Her first perk is Fast Track, which gives you 3 tokens every time another survivor is hooked, up to a maximum of 27 tokens. And when you hit a great skill check, all of the tokens that you currently have are consumed, and it increases your bonus progression on the generator by 1% per token. So for example, if 3 other survivors are hooked, then you would have 9 tokens. So if you hit a great skill check, you'll get an additional 9% on that generator. I just don't think these numbers are worth it at all. Like, it'll maybe save you a couple of seconds on some generators, but it also requires other people to be getting hooked, and perks that require your team to be doing poorly are just not really worth it unless they have a very strong effect. So this perk is getting a 2. Her next perk is Self-Preservation, which removes your scratch marks, grunts of pain, and blood for 10 seconds if a survivor becomes hit within 16 meters of you. This is just so unbelievably situational. I just don't really ever see a reason to use it. Like, in the situations where it is useful, yes, it can be pretty good if you're trying to avoid the killer, like if you're on death hook, for example, but those situations are very few and far between. So I'm going to give it a 2. I could see an argument for it being a 1 because it's just so useless in so many situations. And her last perk is an exhaustion perk called Smash Hit. This perk triggers when you hit a killer with a pallet, and it gives you a 4-second 2-second speed burst instead of the normal 3-second speed burst that you get with other exhaustion perks, and then you become exhausted for only 20 seconds. So unfortunately, this is one of the worst exhaustion perks in the game, but it's still honestly pretty decent. The downside with this perk is that once the killer knows that you have it, they're never gonna let you get a pallet stun again if they're good, but you can of course use this to your advantage and greed pallets more often, which can help you get an extra loop or two in, which is obviously a great mind game to have. This is a very, very fun exhaustion perk, but I don't think it's really worth in comparison to all of the other exhaustion perks that you can get. So I am gonna give it a 2. I can see an argument for it being a 3, especially if the killer isn't exactly good and they don't really realize that you have this perk. This gives Yunjin a total of 6 points, placing her in the C tier. The next survivor on the list is Jill. Jill's first perk is Blast Mine, which activates when you repair generators for a total of 40% progression. And you can press a button to basically arm the generator with a trap that lasts for 2 minutes. And if the killer kicks that gen within those 2 minutes, they'll be stunned and blinded for 4 seconds. This is more of a fun perk than it is a useful perk, but it is honestly pretty useful if you're, especially in a 3-gen situation where the killer is just never chasing you and they're only kicking gens. Being able to not only stun them in place for 4 seconds, but also force them to kick the gen again just wastes a lot of their time. And on the off chance that you like prevent them from being able to pop the gen with Pop Goes the Weasel with it, it just feels insanely good. But the effect isn't like actually that strong, so I am going to give it only a 3. But the killer not being able to kick the gen in 2 minutes is a decent amount of time. Her next perk is Counter Force, which is, it's awful. Like, I'm sorry, this perk is terrible. It's like decent right now because of the Thrill of the Hunt thing, but in general, it is just awful. It's awful. You cleanse totems 20% faster. And every single time you cleanse a totem, you get a stackable 20% increased speed to cleansing the next totem. So the first one will be 20, the second one will be 40, then 60, then 80, then 100%. So double the speed. So it's like a decent effect for cleansing totems a little bit faster and saving you like 2 seconds. And then after you cleanse a totem, the aura of the totem farthest from you is revealed for 4 seconds. So it saves you like a couple seconds per totem, which like realistically, how is that helpful? And most people when this Thrill of the Hunt thing is over won't be using hex perks anyway, unless it's Pentimento Plaything. And seeing the totem that's furthest away from you it's so counterintuitive because you'd be wasting so much time going to that totem to find that and cleanse it. Like if you're, for example, cleansing every totem for a challenge or something, this perk would be so much more useful if it showed you the nearest totem to you. Like why does it show you the furthest one? It doesn't make any sense. And her last perk is Resurgence, which is one of my favorite perks in the game. It makes it so that you're 70% healed every single time you're unhooked. Like it's very, very good. And it can allow you to get healed after being unhooked very, very quickly. So if the killer decides to come back to the hook, you're already healed. So it's like you're never really put into those bad situations. I love this perk and I'm glad they buffed it from 50% to 70%. So it only takes a couple seconds to heal you to full. I'm going to give this perk a total of 4. And this brings Jill into the A tier with a total of 8 points. I'm going to put her above Yui because I think Resurgence is really good. I don't think it's as strong as the Power Struggle combo, but I do think it's better than like Lucky Break and then all of the perks from these 3 survivors. Next up on the list, we have Leon. Leon's first perk is Bite the Bullet. This makes it so that whenever you're healing yourself or another survivor, it suppresses all noises related to healing and grunts of pain. So you heal completely silently. And if you fail a skill check, you do not trigger a loud noise notification. This perk is so much fun. Being able to lose a killer in chase because you just started randomly healing in a corner is hilarious. This is one of the most fun perks in the game. And it also is very practical if you pair it with something like Overcome and Lucky Break, because if you get hit, you run really fast for a really long time. You lose all your scratch marks and pools of blood. And if you're able to get around a corner and start healing, the killer will have absolutely no idea where you went. This is so unbelievably good, especially on indoor maps where it's really easy to lose line of sight. But on outdoor maps, it can be kind of useless because it's hard to do this because obviously the killer can just see you. I'm going to give this perk overall a total of 3. It's a very, very fun perk though, so I'd highly recommend it. His next perk is Flashbang, which activates after repairing gens for a total of 40%. And if you go into a locker, you can craft a flashbang, which just has the same mechanics as a firecracker. So it's basically a one-time use flashlight that's easier to use and also has the added benefit of being able to be used against killers that are looking at the wall as well. So it's like a decent perk. I'm going to give it a 3 because I do think flashbangs are like surprisingly useful, but it does require quite a bit of setup and you don't really get that big of a reward for it, especially if you're bad with flashbangs. So if you're really good with flashbangs, obviously this is a decent perk. And his last perk is Rookie Spirit, which is just, it's just bad. Like it's so bad. Once you hit 3 skill checks, it activates this perk for the rest of the trial and it shows you the auras of any generators if they're regressing. This would have been fantastic during the Ruin Undying meta, but now there's rarely more than one generator that's regressing at a time, and you're probably going to know which generator is regressing because it's usually just a pain res or a pop on the most progressed generator on the map. And as a survivor, you should know which generator has the most progression on the map. So like it kind of gives you information that you should already be able to figure out just by using your brain. It's just very counterintuitive. So I'm going to give it a score of a 1. And this brings Leon into the B tier with a total of 7 points. But I am going to put him above Felix. I'll put him above Steve. I'll put him above Tapp. Yes, above Quentin. And and I'll put him below Ash because I do think that the Power Struggle flip-flop build is better than like the Bite the Bullet Overcome build. But honestly, I could see an argument for these being switched. All right, next up, we got Mikaela. Her first perk is Boon Circle of Healing. I don't think this perk is as bad as people think it is now because you can still get some pretty solid value out of this perk. This is obviously a boon perk, so you have to bless a totem, and then within 24 meters, it has a boon effect range. And if you're in this range, you have double healing speed when not using a medkit. And if a survivor is injured, their aura is revealed to all other survivors. Double healing speed is very, very useful. And if you're able to get a certain map where you can set up a very good boon, for example, on the top of the Ironworks of Misery, or if you're on a map like Gideon Meat Plant where the boon goes through floors, you can get so much value out of this perk when healing. But of course, if you're not very good at placing boons, you can spend so much time getting it ready just for the killer to get rid of it almost immediately. And on a lot of maps, that's just kind of hard to avoid because the totem spawns are so bad. But overall, I'm still going to give this perk a 3 because I do think it can be useful on a lot of maps and a lot of situations. Her next perk is Boon Shadow Step, which is it's just not great. It's another boon perk, and if you're in the boon radius, all scratch marks and auras are hidden from the killer. And these effects also linger for 4 seconds after leaving the range of the boon. So it's like fine if you're trying to stealth, but it's just the fact that it's so restricted to a specific area makes it a little bit difficult to use properly. But if you're able to put this in a good spot, like we'll take the Gideon example again, when you're in chase and you have Shadow Step, it makes it a lot more difficult for the killer to chase you because obviously they can't see your scratch marks. So it makes it a lot more difficult to track. So in those situations, it can be somewhat decent, but those situations are few and far between. So I am going to give this perk a 2 because it's relatively useful in chase, but it does kind of depend on the map and depends on the totem spawns. And her last perk is Clairvoyance, which is super underrated, but I'm still going to give it a 2 because I do think that the usefulness isn't as good as it could be. After you cleanse or bless a totem, Clairvoyance activates, and you can press a button to see the auras of any chests, exit switches, generators, the hatch, or hooks within 64 meters of your location for up to 10 seconds. But the nice part about this perk is that when you activate it, you can deactivate it whenever you want. So you could just briefly trigger it for a little bit just to see some information and not actually hold the power down. So you could kind of just use one instance of this perk for the entire match. And it's not that bad at all. It's a solid information perk. Another nice thing about this perk, which I don't know if they patched it yet, but it makes you lose collision from the killer. So you're able to window tech so much easier, and window teching is just really fun. It works on like a lot of things, including the hatch, which is kind of nice. So like, why would you ever use Left Behind when you could use this perk? And also the fact that you can activate it whenever you want for as long as you want is kind of nice. I'm going to give it a total of 3 points, which places Mikaela in the A tier with a total of 8 points. And I'll put her right next to Dwight. I think that's a good spot for her. The next survivor on this list is Jonah. His first perk is Boon Exponential, which is another boon perk. And if you're in this radius, your recovery speed is twice as fast and it allows you to heal yourself fully from the ground. Unfortunately, although this perk sounds really good on paper, in practice, it's just awful because it's so counterintuitive. You have to be placing it in areas where you would go down to get any use out of this perk because you're not going to crawl across the map to use this perk, which means that the killer will just hear it and go remove it. And it's only useful if you're in a slugging situation. So there's so many situational prerequisites that are required to make this perk even work to get any value out of it that I just have to give it a 1. When you do get value out of it, it feels great, but the odds of you actually getting good value out of it is just so difficult, especially if you have a killer that has some sort of brain. But of course, like all of the other boon perks, if you're able to get it on a second story of any map, and the fact that it goes through floors obviously makes this so much better because you could still get the effects on the other floor without the killer being able to get rid of it immediately. But regardless, it's still getting a 1. His next perk is Corrective Action, which is kind of like Technician, but for other people. You start the trial with 3 tokens, and whenever you hit a great skill check, you gain another token up to a maximum of 5. And then it converts any failed skill checks of other survivors into good skill checks and consumes 1 token. And then the aura of that survivor is revealed to you for 6 seconds, so you know who it is, so you can laugh at them. This perk is only useful if your friend like just bought the game and they're like very, very new to the game. But the only other time it's useful is in my manhunt videos when they're trying to sabotage me on purpose. Besides that, this perk is awful and should never be used. The effect is just not worth it at all, so I'm giving it a score of 1. But his last perk is great. I love his last perk. His last perk is Overcome, which is a very simple exhaustion perk. You know how when you get hit, you have a speed boost for 3 seconds? This perk extends that speed boost by 2 seconds and then causes you to become exhausted for 40 seconds. I'm going to give this perk a score of 4 because it is a fantastic exhaustion perk and pairs really well with a lot of perks like we mentioned earlier. We have like Lucky Break and Bite the Bullet, but even on its own, you don't actually have to synergize it with perks to make it good. It's just there and you just don't have to think about it. You just get the exhaustion perk, you get to run away fast. It deters killers from continuing to chase you because they lose so much distance, and distance is such a huge thing in this game. If you're able to just hold W, killers just don't want to chase that. So it's a really good perk if you don't want to think about your exhaustion perk, but it unfortunately only activates from healthy to injured, which limits this perk a little bit. And if you're going against perks or a killer that can insta down you, you'll pretty much never get use out of this perk. So for example, if you're going against a Bubba, if the Bubba downs you with his chainsaw, you're never going to get use out of this perk. So it's not good enough to the point where it gets a 5, but overall it's a nice set and forget exhaustion perk. This puts Jonah in the C tier with a total of 6 points. However, I'm going to bump him all the way up to an A tier because I do think that Overcome is really, really worth it to get, especially as a newer survivor, because it's a very easy perk to just throw on and get value out of it without you having to do anything. So I'm going to bump him all the way up, all the way up, all the way up, past Jill, past Elodie. I'll even put it past DS and David. I'll put him right here behind Bill. I'm honestly going to bump Bill up to S tier because I think Unbreakable is so worth it. And I'll put Jonah at the top of A tier. It's insane to be bumped all the way up there, but I really do think that Overcome is a great perk to have in general, but especially good for beginners because it's so easy to use. Next up, we have Yoichi. His first perk is Boon Dark Taurie, which I swear this is the worst perk in the game. This is very, very close to the worst perk in the game. It's a boon perk, and when you're within the radius, you get a 2% haste. 2%, that's nothing. This literally does nothing. The fact that you have to spend so much time blessing a totem, and you're only going to get use out of this perk if you bless a totem near where you would be chased, which means that the killer can easily destroy it, and the fact that the effect isn't even good to begin with because it's only 2%, it just makes this perk so bad. Like, you'd get nothing out of this perk. They could bump the haste up to 20% for all I care, and this perk would still not be that good unless you have a double story boon again, because the killer could just easily destroy the boon. But 2% in a little 24-meter radius, like, that's terrible. This is absolutely getting a 1. His next perk is Empathic Connection. This is a cute perk for solo queue. If a survivor is injured, they can see your aura if they're within 96 meters of your location, and your healing speed is increased by 30% across the board. So it's kind of just showing people where to go if they want to get fast heals, which is nice, and you can pair it really well in a healing build to get some very, very quick heals. So I'm going to give it a score of 3. And his last perk is Parental Guidance, which is a very fun perk, especially if you pair it with Smash Hit. Parental Guidance removes your scratch marks and pools of blood and grunts of pain for 7 seconds after stunning the killers by any means. So if you're able to use Smash Hit on the killer, you become super fast for 4 seconds and you lose scratch marks and pools of blood. So it's just, you just escape for free. It's great. But it is very difficult to actually get good value out of this perk, and it's relatively situational, and you kind of have to make a build out of it because using this perk on its own just doesn't really do much, to be honest with you. So I'm going to give this perk a 2, and this places him in the C tier with a total of 6 points. But I am going to put him, I'll put him right here. I think that's a good spot. Next up on the list is Haddie. Her first perk is Inner Focus, which shows you the scratch marks of other survivors, which is a completely useless effect. And then if another survivor loses a health state due to the killer, you can see the aura of the killer for 10 seconds. Okay. So like, I guess you can get some information on where the killer is chasing the survivor, but it's really not that useful. Like, there's so many other perks that are way better and can give you the same exact information, like Alert or even Windows of Opportunity. So this perk is just kind of useless. Like, it doesn't really help you in any way. So I'm going to give it a 1 because it's just terrible. Her next perk is Overzealous, which activates after cleansing or blessing a totem, and it increases your repair speed by 10% if it was a dull totem, and if it was a hex totem by 20%, but then it deactivates after losing a health state by any means. 10% or even 20% repair speed is honestly pretty good, but the fact that it deactivates after losing a health state makes it so that you only have this perk for a certain amount of time. I am going to give it a 2 though. I don't think it's that bad because that's a pretty decent gen progression buff, and gen progression buffs are relatively scary, and if you're able to avoid being injured, you can get some pretty solid value out of this perk, but there are just so many problems with it. 1, it has the prerequisite of cleansing or blessing a totem. 2, if you want the full value out of this perk, it has to be a hex totem, and again, hex totems don't really tend to be used that often, apart from the Thrill of the Hunt meta that we have going on right now, which is inevitably going to disappear soon, and you have to avoid losing a health state. So it's just, when you get good value out of this perk, it's just in very rare situations, so that's why I'm giving it a 2. And lastly, Residual Manifest. This gives the killer the blindness status effect for 30 seconds. It's the only thing, to my knowledge, in the game that gives the killer the blindness status effect, and it allows you to rummage through a chest once per trial to guarantee a basic flashlight. This perk is not very good. Like, the blindness status effect on the killer is surprisingly underrated, so I am going to give this perk a 2 because it means that the killer can't see the auras of anything, including hooks, which can really mess them up when they're carrying a survivor, including generators, so they don't know where to go. Like, blindness is honestly pretty decent, but you also have to successfully blind the killers, so that means you have to bring in a flashlight to get good value out of this perk, and you have to blind them during animations, so it just requires a lot of setup just to give them blindness for 30 seconds, which isn't really that big of a deal. So this unfortunately puts Haddie in the D tier with a total of 5 points. Next up on the list, we have Ada. Ada's first perk is Low Profile. This is again another one of those perks that only activates when you're the last survivor alive, but it also activates if you're the last survivor that's not downed, being carried, or being hooked. So you can technically get usefulness out of this during the match, but it's pretty rare. But when it's active, it suppresses your grunts of pain and pools of blood and scratch marks for a minute and a half. This effect just isn't worth the prerequisite. Like, you can get the same exact effect if you just use Lucky Break and become injured. Like, it's so pointless. This perk is definitely getting a 1. Her next perk is Reactive Healing, and this perk makes it so that if another survivor within 32 meters of your location loses a health state by any means while you're injured, it gives you 50% of your missing healing progression. So if you weren't healed at all, you'll instantly be healed by 50%. And then if someone gets hit again, you'll go to 75%, and so on and so forth. I do actually believe it's possible to be healed fully, because I believe once you get to a certain threshold, the game just counts it as 100% and will just heal you fully. But I think that requires like 4 or 5 reactive healing procs. So realistically, you're never going to get that. But if you're running this perk with a couple friends, it's honestly really fun. Like, you can get so much healing progression so quickly. I'm going to give this perk a 3 because you can save a ton of time on healing. And her last perk is Wiretap, which is one of the coolest perks. I love this perk. It's so much fun to use. It's pretty solid in terms of strength too. If you repair generators for a total of 40%, this perk activates, and you can press a button on a generator that has progression to install a wiretapped trap, which lasts for 2 minutes. And if the killer is within 14 meters of the trapped location, you can see their aura. But then Wiretap deactivates if the generator becomes damaged or when the timer runs out. But the nice thing about this perk is that the aura is revealed to every single survivor on the map, and the trap generator's aura is yellow, so survivors know that it's wiretapped. So if there's no aura, you can also deduce that the killer is somewhere else. So it gives you a lot of really cool information, and if you're able to get in those situations where the killer's chasing you and you're near a gen that has wiretap on it, it is so unbelievably fun, and you just feel like a god with wall hacks. It's insane. Using this perk and pairing it with Blast Mine is also very fun because it puts the killer into a lose-lose situation where they have to kick the gen to get rid of wiretap, but then if they kick the gen, they obviously get stunned by Blast Mine. And I believe they have the same duration of 2 minutes, so it's awesome. It's a really fun combo. So this is getting a score of 3, which places Ada in the B tier with a total of 7 points, but I'm gonna put her all the way. Ooh, this is tough. I'm gonna put her above Leon, because Reactive Healing and Wiretap are pretty solid perks, and Wiretap is just so much fun that even though it's not like amazing by any means, it's still so fun that it's just worth getting just for that alone. All right, moving on to Rebecca. Her first perk is Better Than New, which activates when you heal another survivor. This increases their action speeds for blessing, cleansing, healing, and unlocking by 16% until they take damage. I gotta give this perk a 2. Like, it's pretty awful. The main issue I have with this perk is you're just giving a buff to another person, and if that person doesn't understand how to utilize it properly, or they might not even realize that they even have the perk to begin with because nobody uses this perk, you're not gonna get any value out of it. Yes, it can help in very, very specific situations. For example, if the endgame collapse is happening and you're trying to reset with 2 other people, and you heal one person with Better Than New, then they can heal the next person 16% faster. But realistically, like, that doesn't save you that much time. And I think the perk just has too big of a prerequisite for the value that you get out of it. Like, 16% isn't that much, especially when it's only used for blessing, cleansing, healing, and unlocking, because realistically, the only thing you'd be using it for is healing. Like, honestly, I could see an argument for this perk being a 1, but I could see some potential in some very specific situations if you're using it with friends. Her next perk is Hyper Focus, and in my honest opinion, I feel like this perk was a little bit over exaggerated on how good it was, especially when it came out. I think people have started to realize that it's not actually that useful in comparison to other perks, but I'm still going to give it a 3 because I do think it is a helpful perk. Essentially how it works is every time you hit a great skill check, you get a token, up to 6 tokens, and for each token, it increases the odds of getting a skill check, and the rotation speed of the skill check increases by 4%, but it also increases the skill check bonus progression by 30% of its base value, meaning that it'll keep compounding if you keep hitting great skill checks. But then if you miss a great skill check, you lose all of your tokens and the perk resets. So pretty much the only time you would want to use this perk is if you're pairing it with the perk Stakeout, which converts your good skill checks into great skill checks, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to get enough tokens to actually get good value out of this perk, because realistically, the bonus for hitting a great skill check isn't that much. So increasing it by only 30% per token really isn't going to save you that much time. However, if you pair it with Stakeout, Stakeout kind of becomes your backup in case you miss one of the great skill checks. And Stakeout can have up to 4 tokens, so you can pretty much get up to 4 extra chances to keep this perk going, which can be somewhat useful if you're doing a gen rush build. But overall, I do think this perk isn't as overtuned as a lot of people think it was, and it can be useful in specific builds, but a lot of the time you're not going to get the value out of this perk that you may think. And her last perk is Reassurance, which is a fantastic anti-camping perk. If you're within 6 meters of a hooked survivor, you can press the active ability button to pause their sacrifice progress for 30 seconds, as well as any skill checks that they get if they're in the struggle phase. So this is like reverse camaraderie that we talked about earlier on Steve, but you can activate it whenever you want, and you can use it once per survivor per hook instance. So you can use it so many more times, it's way better. I am going to give this perk a 4. I honestly would have given it a 5, but ever since the anti-camp mechanic came to the game, it hasn't really been as necessary. Like, obviously there's still killers who will camp and there's still killers who will proxy camp because the anti-camp mechanic isn't super strict. So in those situations, especially if you're against something like a Bubba or a Huntress or a Trickster who are really good camping killers, then this perk could be very useful to help your team maybe get some extra time to reset or just give you extra time to come up with a plan on how to get the survivor off the hook. I think it can be game changing, especially with the fact that you can use this perk through floors. So if you're on Gideon Meat Plant, for example, and you're underneath a hooked survivor, you can still use it and it'll still work, which is a really, really useful tool to know about. So overall, this gives Rebecca a total score of 9, placing her in the S tier. However, I am going to bump her down to the top of A tier because I don't think her perks just quite reach that S tier mark. Reassurance is definitely a good perk, but I don't think it's good enough to prioritize over all of these survivors in the S tier. All right, moving on to Vittorio. His first perk is Fogwise, and I love this perk. Like, I don't know what it is about this perk, but I really like it. It activates when you succeed a great skill check while repairing a gen, and all it does is reveal the aura of the killer for 6 seconds. To me, this is like a side grade of Alert, so if you like Alert, I think you'll also like this perk because you can essentially activate it whenever you want, as long as you get a skill check, obviously, on a gen. But if you're able to hit those great skill checks, which as you get better at playing in the game, you'll start to hit them pretty consistently, you get free wall hacks on the killer for a lot of the match. So it's a very useful solo queue device to kind of see where the killer is. I do think that the information that Alert gives you is better than the information that Fogwise gives you, purely because you can get more out of it, such as seeing if pallets or doors are broken. But Fogwise is still a fun perk that can give you some great information on the whereabouts of the killer if you don't know where they are because you're not on comms or something. And since I'm comparing it to Alert, it does give you additional information that Alert doesn't give, especially if the killer is not chasing a survivor. And it can kind of just keep you aware of your surroundings, especially if it's a stealth killer, because you'll know that they're in their stealth mode if you hit a great skill check and you don't see them. Overall, I'm going to give this perk a 4. I feel like some people might give this a 3, but I genuinely think that the information that you can gather out of this perk is a lot better than you may realize, and you can activate it so often. His next perk is Potential Energy, which is such a unique and cool idea for a perk, but I just don't think it's executed well enough to make it a decent perk. Essentially what it is you can activate it while you're working on a gen, and instead of the progression going towards the gen, it goes into this perk instead, and then you can take that progression and instantly apply it to a different gen. So the idea of this perk is to help you in 3 gen situations, because you could activate this perk on one gen that's maybe far away from the killer, that is maybe at 0%, and then take all of the progress that you make in this perk and go to another gen that's maybe like 80% and instantly pop it or instantly give it a ton of progress. So in theory, it's really good, but just in practice, it's not worth the amount of time you have to spend doing the gen to charge up this perk. Unfortunately, I do think this perk is a very slippery slope in terms of balancing, because of course, anything that increases the gen speeds will kind of break the balance of the game. So if they buff this perk even a little bit, it could become extremely strong. So I have a feeling they're not really going to touch it. I'm sadly going to give this perk a score of 2, just because I feel like it's way too situational, but I would love to see this perk get buffed just a tiny bit if they can figure out a way to do it properly, because I think it's a very, very unique perk. And his third perk is Quick Gambit, which activates when you're being chased by the killer, and it allows you to see the auras of all other survivors, as well as increasing everyone's repair speed by 5%. And then it deactivates for 60 seconds when you lose a health state. This used to be genuinely one of the worst perks in the game, because it used to only apply the effects for survivors that were within 24 meters of your location, which is a very, very small radius. And it was so counterintuitive, because the killers would just go to a gen if they heard it being worked on. They wouldn't just continue chasing someone. So I'm glad they changed it so that it increases the repair speed of other survivors anywhere on the map. I think it's a good idea in practice if you'd like to be the one that's chased, especially if you're a solo queue demon and you're always wondering why gens never get finished. This perk could help slightly with that, but still 5% is barely anything. So it's only going to save a couple of seconds on gens, which is why I'm going to give this perk a score of 2, bringing Vittorio to a total of 8, which places him in the A tier. And I think I'm going to put him honestly at the bottom of A tier is fine, because his only good perk in my opinion is Fogwise, but I think you could easily just use Alert for a very similar effect, so it's not that necessary to get. Moving on to Thalita. Her first perk is Cut Loose. It's kind of like a side grade to Quick and Quiet. It activates for 6 seconds when you do a fast vault, and then if you vault again within those 6 seconds, it'll be completely silent and then go on cooldown for 45 seconds. So it's pretty much just a worse version of Quick and Quiet in my opinion. Like, it has potential on paper, but in practice, it's just way too hard to pull off, because realistically, the way you use this is, for example, at Shack, if you're able to fast vault from the outside to the inside and force the killer to go towards the inside of the shack, like one of the doors or something, but then you quickly rush vault back out, they won't hear you, so it'll continue going inside of shack only to see that you're not there. So you can get some distance off of that, but I feel like there's only a few specific windows and palettes where you could actually get good value out of this to make this perk even worth running as one of your perk slots. I'm going to give this a score of 2. I feel like there are definitely some buffs that they could give this perk to make it a little bit more useful. Maybe even just having it activate on every other rush vault. Something like that could make it really interesting, but that might be a little bit too overtuned. Her next perk is friendly competition, and oh my god, it's awful. It's terrible. First off, you have to complete a generator with one other person. In general, unless you're using Prove Thyself, you don't want to be completing generators with other survivors because it's reduced efficiency. But if you do end up doing this and you activate that, it increases your repair speed and the repair speed of any other survivor who repairs it with you for 5% for the next 75 seconds. Now that's not bad. Like 5% isn't bad for that effect. Like it doesn't really require that much effort, but the problem is that it only activates for 75 seconds. And a large majority of those 75 seconds will be finding another generator to work on. And in a lot of situations after you finish a gen, you're not going to be immediately going to the next gen to work on it. A lot of times you'll need to heal someone, or you'll need to go save someone off hook, or you'll need to take chase or take pressure off of a survivor. Like there's so many different things that you'll need to do when you complete a gen that I feel like in most situations, by the time you get to another gen, you'll have maybe like a maximum of 30 seconds of plus 5% gen speed, which will save you a few seconds. So I just don't really see a point in using this perk when there's a lot better gen rush perks out there. And her last perk is Teamwork Power of 2, which is just a better version of Blood Pact in my opinion. Like it's quite literally the same thing, but with worse numbers that are active more often. And I personally think that that's better because you get more consistent value throughout the match. But essentially what it does is whenever you finish healing another survivor, the perk activates and both of you become 5% faster as long as you stay within 16 meters of one another. So yes, you can pair this with a bunch of other haste perks in a build to make you go really fast and even faster than the killer in some cases, but that requires so much setup to make it actually worth running that it's not legitimately worth the effect, even though it's extremely fun to do. Like if you can get the chance to do this, it's a very, very fun thing to try to get, but effectiveness wise, it's not actually that effective. I'm going to give this perk a total score of 2, placing her in the D tier, unfortunately, with a total score of 5. And I think I'm going to put her above Cheryl, but below Ace. Honestly, I'm going to bump Ace up to C tier just because of Open-Handed and Kindred. That perk combination is so good that he's not like worth the D tier slot because of that. All right, moving on to Renato. His first perk is Background Player, which is probably his best perk in my opinion. It activates for 10 seconds after another survivor is picked up. And if you sprint within those 10 seconds, you get a 50% haste for 5 seconds and then become exhausted for 20 seconds. So pretty much the only point in using this perk is if you're going for a flashbang save or a flashlight save or a pallet save, or if you're trying to like sabotage a hook or something, and it does a great job at doing that. Plus, if you're just running around the map trying to do something, you can also get value just out of good traversal, especially because the exhausted status effect only lasts for 20 seconds, so it goes away a lot faster than other exhaustion perks. But I am still going to give this perk a 3 because although I do think it's useful in a lot of those situations where you're trying to go for a save, many times the killer will just not be in a position where you can get a save to begin with. Like they're either looking at a wall, or they're too far away, or they're not over a pallet, etc, etc. So yes, you can use this perk to go for saves, but if you're not able to get a save and you're just kind of trying to use this perk for traversal, then you're not getting that great of value and you'd be better off just running something like Sprint Burst. But still a pretty decent exhaustion perk and is a great thing to add to your loadout if you enjoy the altruistic playstyle. His second perk is Blood Rush, which activates for 60 seconds after you get unhooked, and it allows you to press the active ability button to instantly recover from the exhausted status effect, but it becomes deactivated after use or if you perform a conspicuous action. So this essentially means that you can get a second use out of an exhaustion perk such as Sprint Burst or Dead Hard, which can be a great way to counteract tunneling. Because think about it, if you have something like Off the Record, for example, and the killer hits you off the hook, you're going to get the speed boost out of that. And then if you use an exhaustion perk like Sprint Burst or like Lithe, for example, you'll get even more distance out of that. And then you can reset your exhaustion and use it again. So it's just kind of insane the amount of distance that you can get from this perk. This can be a great way to get away from the killer and de-incentivize them from actually chasing you. So I'm going to give this perk a score of 3 because I think it's pretty solid and can be useful in a lot of situations, but I still do think that there are better anti-tunneling perks out there like we've talked about previously. And lastly, he has Teamwork Collective Stealth, which is god awful. It is so bad. It activates when another survivor finishes healing you, and both of you guys lose your scratch marks as long as you stay within 16 meters of one another. There's just no point in this. Like, it's just not worth it. The stealth playstyle already isn't that optimal, but also the fact that you have to stay within 16 meters of the other other person to get this effect that's not even that good to begin with it's just not worth it at all. It's too much of a prerequisite, and it just has too many requirements for something that isn't really going to give you value anyway. So of course this perk is getting a 1. That's going to give him a total of 7 points, placing him in the B tier, but I am going to put him above Felix because I do think that background player is a great perk to use, especially at lower levels. If you're able to get flashlight saves and pallet saves and you know how to do them properly, but you're still at kind of a lower MMR where killers don't necessarily know how to counter them just yet, it can be a great way to get some free saves. Moving on to Gabriel, his first perk is made for this, which activates when you're in the injured state. This will give you the endurance status effect for 10 seconds after you heal another survivor, but the endurance will be canceled prematurely if you perform a conspicuous action. And on top of that, you get a permanent 3% haste while you're running, as long as you're suffering from the deep wound status effect. So unfortunately, this perk is obviously not as good as it used to be when it came out, because now you only get that 3% if you're in deep wound, but you still can find some value in it, especially if you run it with dead hard, because obviously dead hard puts you into the deep wound state. Because if you have your dead hard active and you're able to do a successful dead hard so that you're put into the deep wound state, then you're going to get this 3% haste for the remainder of your chase, which can be very beneficial. But if you don't run this with dead hard, you're likely never really going to get use out of this perk unless you're in a situation where you're being tunneled and the killer hits you off the hook, or if you have off the record or something. So it's kind of situational depending on your build or what the killer decides to do, but I still think it's a pretty decent perk that you can find value out of even after the nerf. And you still have the benefit of gaining endurance after healing a survivor, which can be a great way to take hits and take pressure off of other survivors. So overall, I'm going to give this perk a 3. His second perk is Scavenger. I don't like this perk. I don't know what it is. I'm not going to give it a 1 though, because I do think that there could be some value found in it, but I just don't think the prerequisites are really worth the value. After you deplete a toolbox, this perk activates, and if you hit 5 great skill checks after this point, this perk will deactivate, although it will fully recharge your toolbox. But when you do this, your repair speed will be reduced by 50% for the next 30 seconds, which just makes this perk so weird to use. Like, you have to activate the perk, and then you have to go out of your way to find something else to do for the next 30 seconds. Otherwise, you're going to be repairing at 50% less speed, which isn't really worth it. So if you're in like a Survive with Friends, for example, it can be decent because, for example, if you're working on a gen with someone else who has proved thyself and they're injured, you can just say that you want to proc your Scavenger, and then during the 30 seconds of reduced repair speed, heal them. So you're at least being kind of productive during the downside of this perk. But 30 seconds is just so long. And I know toolboxes are really good, but the downside of this perk is just way too hefty to make it good. So I'm going to give it a score of 2. Oh, it also has the added ability of being able to rummage through a chest to guarantee a basic toolbox. But the time you spend doing this will cancel out the time you save by using this toolbox. So it's not really worth it in my opinion. And lastly, he has Troubleshooter, which activates when you're being chased by the killer. And it shows you the aura of the generator with the most progress. This part of the perk is nice to know, but isn't worth a perk slot. However, it shows you the aura of the killer for 6 seconds after you drop a pallet. And this is why this perk is actually somewhat decent. 6 seconds is a surprisingly decent amount of time for being in chase, and it's very useful for making unsafe pallets a lot safer because you can see what the killer is doing. There are so many unsafe pallets on maps nowadays. Like, they've just been removing all of the good pallets and replacing them with just terrible pallets over the past few years. So being able to get wall hacks on the killer if you're not able to see the killer because of the unsafe pallet loop can help tremendously with giving you an opportunity to get away from that pallet. Granted, it's not going to help in every situation, especially because a lot of pallets you can just see the killer anyway, but in things like pallet gyms, for example, where it's just the one pallet and then the walls, it can be surprisingly useful. So I'm going to give this perk a 3, which places Gabriel in the A tier with a total score of 8. Although I'm going to put him above Vittorio, and I'm going to put him above Jeff as well, and Nancy, honestly. Honestly, maybe even Mikaela. I think Troubleshooter and Made for This are both decent enough perks if you know how to use them properly, but they do take a little bit more game knowledge and map knowledge to use well, so just keep that in mind. They're not very straightforward to use like other perks. All right, moving on to Nicolas Cage. Before I say anything, this character, if you just want to have a good time, this is the character to buy because his perks are very, very fun. Like, if you're just looking to have a good time and you're not looking for the best perks in existence or whatever, he just has fun perks. Like, they're just fun to use. So just keep that in mind. His first perk is Dramaturgy, which is a little bit complicated, so bear with me here. While you're healthy, this perk activates, and if you're running, you can press the active ability button to get a 25% haste for 2 seconds, and then you'll get one of 4 different effects after those 2 seconds are up. You either become exposed for 12 seconds, your haste gets extended for another 2 seconds, you scream but without notifying the killer, or you receive a random item of rare rarity with a random selection of add-ons attached to it, automatically dropping any previously held item. And then you become exhausted for 40 seconds. So this is just the gambling perk. Like, it's literally just just a gambling perk. You can have a short little sprint burst basically whenever you want as long as you're healed, and then you either get a good effect or a bad effect. And this is just so much fun to have, even if it's not like super incredible compared to other perks. But regardless, it's still a good perk. Being able to get that haste whenever you want is still a very solid effect, and having a 25% chance of it being extended for another 2 seconds, essentially doubling the effect of this perk, can be very solid. So I'm going to give this perk a 3 because obviously it can put you into detrimental situations, like if you get exposed, for example, and you get insta-downed. Obviously, that wouldn't be that great. But in general, it does actually give you some pretty good effects and is worth running, even if you're not just using it for fun. So I could honestly see an argument for it being up to a 4, but I still personally think that it is a 3. His second perk is Plot Twist, which is hilarious. If you're injured, you can activate this perk, and if you crouch while standing still, you can press the active ability button to down yourself. Literally, you can down yourself on your own, and it makes you completely silent. You lose all pools of blood, and it gives you the ability to fully recover from the dying state. And if you're able to successfully do this and recover from the dying state after using this perk, you become fully healed and gain 50% haste for 4 seconds. But I believe you can only use this perk twice per trial, once during the trial and a second time after you power the exit gates. This perk is unbelievably fun because, especially on maps with like really good hiding spots such as Dead Dog in the bushes, you can go down and be super hidden because you obviously don't make any noise. So the killer's gonna have no idea where you went in many situations, and you'll be able to get up fully healed and get a huge sprint burst, which is so hilarious when you're able to pull it off. I'm gonna give this perk a 3. I think it's actually surprisingly useful, but it is obviously very risky because if you down yourself, that saves a lot of time for the killer, especially if they find you. So there could be a huge detriment to this perk if you're not able to use it properly. Still one of the most fun perks in the entire game. And his last perk, which is arguably not that interesting compared to the other two, this is Scene Partner. Whenever you're inside of the terror radius, this perk activates, and if you look at the killer, it causes you to scream and reveals their aura for 5 seconds. And there's a 50% chance that you'll scream again, extending the aura reveal duration by another 2 seconds. And then it goes on cooldown for 60 seconds. So it's not terrible, I guess. Like, it lets you figure out where the killer's coming from, but it also tells the killer where you are, which a lot of times won't be that big of a deal because the killer probably already knows that you're there with like barbecue or chili or just game sense. So realistically, it's not that bad of an effect. Like, it doesn't give you enough value to make it worth running in a perk slot. Like, there's so many other killer aura revealing perks that are just better than this one and can give you a lot more value, like Alert or Fogwise that we've talked about, that I just don't really see a point in running this perk. So I am going to give it a 2, but I do think that you can find some value out of it in certain situations. This gives him a total of 8 points, placing him in the A tier, and I'm honestly going to put him all the way to, I'm going to put him above Yui. I think this is a good spot for him. Actually, Ooh, this is tough. You know what? I'm going to put him above Jill. I think having Dramaturgy in your arsenal will be worth it. And there's just so many fun perks that I do want to take that into account because, you know, obviously you want to be enjoying the game that you're playing. So if you're able to use those perks, you'll have a lot more fun than trying to just use, you know, the meta perks. Next up, we got Ellen Ripley. Her first perk is Chemical Trap, which activates when you repair generators for a total of 20%. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the same generator. You just have to do a total of 20% over the course of multiple generators. And when it's active, you can press the active ability button while near a dropped pallet to install a trap, which stays there for a minute. And if the killer breaks that trapped pallet, the trap explodes, causing the killer to become hindered by 50% for 4 seconds, which is a pretty significant slowdown. However, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the killer can see that the trap is on the pallet, so they could just choose not to break it, completely mitigating the point of this perk. So you pretty much have to use this perk on god pallets where the killer is forced to break it. But in general, a majority of the perks nowadays are unsafe pallets that the killer can just play around anyway, so you're not going to get that much value out of it. But I am going to give it a 2 because you can get value on this perk if you use it on the right pallets, but those pallets are pretty few and far between, so I just don't necessarily think it's worth the perk slot. Her next perk is Light-Footed, which activates while you're healthy, and it completely suppresses the sound of your footsteps while running. And it also goes on cooldown for 20 seconds after fast vaulting for some reason. I don't think this perk is good. Like, first of all, it only activates while you're healthy, and I think they did this because if you paired it with Iron Will, then you'd be literally silent, like completely silent when you're injured. No grunts of pain, no footsteps, no breathing, anything. So it'd be like you don't even exist. But also, like, while you're healthy, yes, obviously not being able to hear footsteps is a somewhat decent effect. But if the killer is close enough to hear your footsteps, they're likely close enough to hear your breathing anyway. So I just don't, it just seems really counterintuitive. I don't know. And I don't really get the point of having a cooldown on this perk. I feel like it could be activated always and it'd still not be that great. So I'm going to give this perk a score of 2. If you think I'm undervaluing this perk, please let me know. But in general, most people don't track sounds from footsteps anyway. They track it from breathing and from grunts of pain. So I don't think it's a super appealing stealth perk. And her last perk is Lucky Star, which activates while you're hiding inside of a locker, and it just completely suppresses your grunts of pain. So you'll be fully silent if you get into a locker. And then when you exit the locker, for the next 30 seconds, you're still completely silent. You don't leave any pools of blood. You can see the auras of other survivors, and you can see the aura of the closest generator to you. And then the perk deactivates for 30 seconds. So it has some like interesting, unique effects. And on paper, it sounds somewhat decent for information and for stealth, but realistically, it's just a weird prerequisite, like having to go inside of a locker and then get out of the locker and then losing your pools of blood and grunts of pain. It's just a little counterintuitive because you'll want to lose your pools of blood and grunts of pain if you're in chase, but you're likely not going to be getting into a locker in chase anyway, unless you have quick and quiet. But if you have quick and quiet, you have to slow vault either getting in or slow vault either getting out if you don't want to make that much noise, because obviously if you fast vault out of the locker, the killer's going to know where you went, and you don't lose your scratch marks, so they can still track you. So it's just kind of weird, and you have to be in a very, very specific situation to get value out of it. But I think if you are able to pull it off and get that value, it can be somewhat decent. But it's just so hard to pull off that I'm going to give this perk a 2 as well, which places her in the C tier with a total of 6 points. And I am going to keep her at the bottom of C tier. All right, moving on to Alan Wake. His first perk is Boon Illumination, and it's not good. This is a boon perk where if you're in the boon's radius, the auras of all chests and generators are revealed to you, and it also increases your action speeds for blessing and cleansing by 10% while you have a lit boon totem. I just don't really see the point in running this perk. Like, it's pretty easy to find chests and generators anyway, and there's also so many perks that do this without a prerequisite, so it just doesn't really make sense. I am going to give it a 2 though, because obviously you can give this effect to every single survivor, which can help in some situations on solo queue if your survivors are like completely brain dead and have no idea what's going on. But realistically, the effect that you get from this perk is just not worth the prerequisite of setting up a boon totem that can easily be broken by the killer. Like, they could buff this perk to make it actually useful by showing you the auras of everything. I feel like they could buff this perk to show you so many more auras, such as the exit gates, the hatch, the, pallets that are still up, breakable doors that haven't been broken, your teammates, other totems, or even the killer if they're like a certain distance away or something. There's so much more the behavior could do with this perk to make it actually worth running. Even if it just showed you the auras of all totems on the map, that would be a perfectly fine buff for this perk, and it would be a great way to counter stuff like Pentimento Plaything. But as of now, it's just not really that great. His next perk is Champions of Light, which makes you 50% faster while you're shining your flashlight, and if you're able to blind the killer by any means, they become hindered by 20% for 6 seconds, and then it goes on cooldown for 60 seconds, because obviously it'd be quite annoying if you're able to chain blind them, which is counterable by the killer, but still. This perk is decent. It kind of mitigates the downside of blinding the killer while they're stuck in an animation, which is one of the most common uses of flashlights. In general, if you don't have Iron Will, I'd recommend not blinding killers at flashlights because they can easily track you with your sounds. If you're injured, of course. I mean, they can still track you if you're healthy with your breathing, but it's much more difficult. However, with Champion of Light, you can walk so much faster while shining your flashlight that you don't really lose that much distance, so it can be worth it. Plus, you'll be able to make them 20% slower for the next 6 seconds, which gives you even more distance. So it's honestly not that bad. It is a surprisingly useful perk in 1v1s if you're into those. So I'm going to give this a score of 3 because it can be used in a ton of situations, and it's not like the most substantial effect ever, but the fact that you can use it so often makes it a pretty decent chase perk. And lastly, he has Deadline. Oh my god, this perk is awful. Like, it is actually awful. If you're ever injured, this perk activates, and it increases the odds of getting skill checks by 10%, but it causes skill checks to appear in random places on your screen and reduces the penalty for missed skill checks by 50%. There is no reason to run this perk. Getting 10% more skill checks does literally nothing. It does literally nothing, and it also makes your skill checks harder. This perk wouldn't even be good if it didn't have the downside. So I don't even know why it has the downside to begin with. They can make this perk kind of like Hyper Focus, where if you hit a skill check, it increases the odds by another 10%, but then makes the skill check a little bit faster, and this keeps stacking until you miss a skill check. Then I could see it being kind of interesting. But as of now, this perk will save you like less than 5 seconds of time for healing and repairing. It's so bad. Like, it's actually so bad. It's definitely getting a 1, which places Alan Wake in the D tier. But because of Champion of Light, I am going to put him at the top of D tier because I do think Champion of Light is a solid perk, but it's not like that worth getting in comparison to some other perks on here. Next up on the list, we have a fan favorite, and that is Sable Ward. Our first perk is Invocation Weaving Spiders, which is getting a 1. It is terrible. Invocation is a new perk type that came with this survivor, and it basically allows allows you to go in the basement and kind of do this like ritual thing where you get down on your knees in the back of the basement and you have to sit there for 60 seconds to complete it. And while you're doing this, your aura is revealed to all other survivors and they can join in, which doubles the speed if they have an invocation perk equipped as well, or by 50% if they don't. And then once the invocation is completed, you get a specific effect. For weaving spiders, it permanently reduces the repair charges of all generators on the map by 10 charges. So it's essentially like giving every single generator on the map a brand new part, but you become broken for the rest of the trial. And this single sentence makes this perk not worth using. The fact that you become injured for the rest of the match just to save a couple seconds off of every gen is so not worth it at all that there's genuinely no point in using this perk ever. Like it's just not worth it. Like it has such a massive prerequisite and such a massive downside for a semi-decent effect. The cons don't outweigh the pros. So obviously this is getting a score of 1. Her next perk is Strength in Shadows, which is a really useful perk that's kind of a side grade to self-care. It allows you to self-care while you're in the basement without needing a med kit at 70% of the normal healing speed. So it's double the speed of self-care, but it requires you to go in the basement. And then when you finish this heal, you can see the aura of the killer for 10 seconds. So honestly, not that bad, and it can be useful in a lot of situations. I would say the only bad part of this perk is obviously if the killer sees that you go down into the basement, that's not good for you because now you're giving them a free basement hook. But also sometimes the basement isn't in a very good position, so it's kind of not worth going out of your way to go to that basement. But if you're on a map with a centralized basement, this perk can be actually surprisingly useful. So I'm going to give it a score of 3. And her last perk, Wicked, is essentially Deliverance that doesn't have a prerequisite but can only be activated in the basement. So it allows you to unhook yourself if your first hook is in the basement, and then once you unhook yourself, you can see the aura of the killer for 20 seconds. So you do have to go out of your way to get value out of this perk, but if you're able to get near the basement or to the basement during your chase, this can be a great way to just destroy killer pressure in the same way that Deliverance destroys killer pressure. Obviously, it's a lot riskier than Deliverance because you're in the basement, so if it's like a Bubba or something that can down you very fast, or a Huntress, they can get you to second stage really easily. But to be honest, if the killer's that close anyway, it's a lot less risky than having 2 people down there coming up from the basement, because 2 people being hooked in the basement is obviously way worse. So I'm going to give this perk a score of 4. I think it's a really solid perk if you're able to use it properly and can make the killer lose a lot of pressure. This gives Sable a total of 8 points, but I'm going to put her near the top right below Elodie because I think Strength in Shadows and Wicked are great perks and they're pretty easy to use as well. Next up, we have the Troupe. Oh my god, their perks are terrible. Like, they're actually so bad. Their first perk is Bardic Inspiration, which is the guitar perk that I'm sure you've seen. If you're standing completely still, you can press the active ability button to enter the performance interaction, which is just you whipping out the guitar, and it lasts for 15 seconds, and it empowers other survivors within 16 meters of your location. And the effect of this empowerment depends on what you roll from a D20, which is a 20-sided die, and it activates for 90 seconds. So if you roll a 1, you scream, but without notifying the killer. If you roll a 2 to a 10, any skill check that the survivors that are empowered hit grant an extra 1% progression. From 11 to 19, any skill checks grant a 2% extra progression. And if you roll a D20, the skill checks grant a 3% extra progression. And then this perk goes on a cooldown for 90 seconds. I want to like this perk because it's the guitar perk and it's a funny meme in the DVD community, but unfortunately the effects that this perk gives are just not that great. Not only do you have to spend 15 seconds doing nothing, you have to be within 16 meters of a survivor. And you could have low-key just spent those 15 seconds working on the gen, which probably would have made more gen progression than you would get from the extra progression from skill checks. So like it kind of works against itself in a way, but obviously if you roll a high number, getting that 2% or 3% progression per skill check can be somewhat useful, but it is a gamble. Obviously that's the entire point of this perk. So I'm going to give it a 2 overall. I would give it a 1, but the fact that you can get some value out of it if you roll a high number bumps this perk up to a 2 for me. The next perk is Mirrored Illusion, which is one of the coolest perks in this game, and it's just not good, which makes me so sad. It feels like there's so many really unique perks in this game that are just not that good, and it just devastates me. This perk activates if you repair generators for a total of 20%, and while active, if you press the active ability button while next to a chest and execute a generator or a totem, it spawns an illusion of yourself for a minute. So it spawns a fake clone of yourself on that object as though they're interacting with it, if that makes sense. So this is a cool perk, but the issue with this perk is it's kind of obvious that it's a clone because of the effects that it has. And you can just kind of tell that it's not real. And I'm not giving it a 1. I'm going to give it a 2 because from far away, it is kind of difficult to tell that it's an illusion. So it might waste the killer's time sometimes, but in general, it's just too obvious, especially because I don't think the illusion actually has animations either. It's just like a still character on the object, so that makes it even more obvious. And last but not least, still sight, which is so awful. It's actually so awful. It genuinely makes no sense. If you stand still for 4 seconds, it activates and shows you the aura of the killer, chests, and generators within 24 meters of your location until you start moving again. Somebody tell me the point of this perk. I don't get it. But seeing the aura of the killer is obviously great, and seeing the aura of chests and generators is also great, but it's only within 24 meters if you're standing still for 4 seconds. It doesn't make sense. Like, if you're within 24 meters of one of these 3 things, you're probably gonna know where they are anyway, because you can see them with your eyes. So like, I don't get it. Why is it 24 meters? It should be outside of 24 meters. That would make a lot more sense, but it's not. So it's such a bad perk. And obviously being able to see the aura of the killer is great, but you're never going to use this perk in chase, because when are you ever going to find 4 seconds to stand completely still in chase? And if you're out of chase, you probably know where the killer is because you could see them or you can hear them. Like, it's so bad. I don't get it. Obviously this perk is getting a 1, placing them in the D tier. And I don't even know if I want to place them above any other characters. They're just that bad. We're finally on to the last 3 survivors in this game. If you've made it this far, go put a pig emoji down in the comment section below so I know that you're a legend who watched the entire video. And remember, we're trying to hit our like goal of 10,000 likes. So if you haven't already liked it and you've enjoyed this content and you felt that it's been very helpful, feel free to drop a like as it helps me out a ton. But let's move on to Lara Croft, who has one of my favorite new perks that they've released, and this is Finesse. Whenever you're healthy, Finesse activates and it increases your vaulting speed for a fast vault by 20% and then goes on cooldown for 30 seconds. This is such an unbelievably fun chase perk. Being able to vault extremely quickly every 30 seconds is a surprisingly useful effect. Like, you know how the vault speed build with Spine Chill and Resilience was a huge thing back in the day? Finesse is essentially that perk combination, but better, and it's only 1 perk. Once you have a ton of experience in this game, you'll start to realize how useful having a faster vault speed is to get out of very, very tight situations where the killer just narrowly misses you. Like, it can legitimately be the difference between a chase being 30 seconds or 2 minutes. It's kind of insane. Obviously, there will be some games where you get 0 value out of it, because obviously if the killer never gets in a situation where it's a narrow miss, then this perk won't really be that useful. But those situations happen a lot more than you may think, so I'm going to give this perk a score of 4. Her next perk is called Hardened, and this perk activates after unlocking a chest or blessing or cleansing a totem, and it suppresses your urge to scream from any cause and instead shows you the aura of the killer for 5 seconds. This isn't a terrible effect, but the only issue with this perk is it only counters things that make you scream, which is pretty much just Clown, Doctor, Infectious Fright, and maybe a couple other perks. I would give this perk a 1 because of how situational it is, but it activates from the urge to scream from any cause, which means that you can pair this perk with your own survivor perks, such as the Nicolas Cage perks that make you scream, to get some surprisingly useful value out of this perk. Like, let's take Dramaturgy, for example, which has the 2 downsides and the 2 upsides for after you use that little sprint burst thing. One of the downsides is screaming. So if you pair this with Hardened, that downside turns into an upside because you're able to see the aura of the killer for 5 seconds instead of screaming. So it single-handedly buffs that perk by like 25%. So it's not that bad if you pair it with the right perks or if you get the right killer. But in general, it's just so niche and situational. I am going to give it a 2 just because of how niche it is and the fact that you have to pair it with another perk to get actual value out of it. And her last perk is Specialist, which is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. Whenever you unlock or rummage through a chest, you gain a token up to a maximum of 6 tokens. And if you hit a great skill check while repairing a generator, it consumes all tokens. And this permanently reduces the repair charge requirement of that generator by 4 charges per token. And it's just not worth it. Like, it's really just not worth it. You have to spend so much time searching a chest or rummaging a chest. Rummaging requires you to run an entirely other perk to begin with. And it takes what, like 10, 12 seconds or something to search through a chest. So you're spending so much time searching chests just to essentially apply a brand new part on a generator. The time commitment required for the prerequisite is just so not worth it for the value that you get out of this perk. Because not only do you have to search and rummage the chests, which takes time, you also have to A, spend time finding the chests, and B, spend time getting to the chests. So you'll spend minutes upon minutes getting to that 6 token mark just to save a little bit of progression on a gen. Like, it makes no sense. It's so counterintuitive. So obviously this perk is getting a 1. And so this places Lara in the B tier with a score of 7. But I'm going to bump her all the way up to honestly below Jake, just because Finesse is such a fun perk to use and is a surprisingly useful perk as well. All right, moving on to Trevor. Trevor's first perk is Exaltation, and this makes it so that every time you stun the killer with a pallet, it upgrades the rarity of your held item item to the next tier and recharges it by 25%, and then it goes on cooldown for 30 seconds. This sounds great on paper because upgrading the rarity of your item and recharging it for a pretty easy requirement sounds like kind of decent. But if you actually think about it and you actually dive deep into this perk, there are very few items that you would actually need to do this with. The first issue is there's such a huge abundance of blood points in the economy that you're likely gonna have any item and add-ons that you want anyway, so you don't necessarily need to upgrade the rarity when you could just bring it in. But also, it can be a detriment to you as well. Like for example, you could have a green Commodious toolbox, which is the best toolbox in the game, but if it gets upgraded with this perk, there's a 50% chance that it'll turn into the purple Alex's toolbox, which is only used for sabotaging. And you're not gonna bring sabotaging add-ons with a Commodious toolbox because the Commodious toolbox is used for repairing. So it's just like the one thing you'd want to use it on that would get good value out of recharging can turn it completely useless. And it doesn't really matter for flashlights or medkits anyway, because medkits rarities like basically do nothing anymore. It doesn't matter. Like the difference between a brown medkit and a purple medkit is like nothing. But also for a flashlight, getting an extra few seconds, you're probably not going to be using the entirety of a flashlight anyway. So it doesn't really matter if you have an extra few seconds. Plus you can just bring a purple flashlight into the trial. Like it's such a weird counterintuitive perk. I think this perk would be a lot better back in the day. This perk just came at the wrong time. If it came out way back in the day when there was an actual difference between rarities of medkits and higher rarity items were a lot more rare because you didn't have as many blood points as we do nowadays, then I could see this perk being decent. But right now I have to give it a 2 because it's just so bad in this current meta. His next perk is Eyes of Belmont. Whenever a generator is completed, the aura of the killer is revealed to you for 5 seconds, and it also increases the duration of the killer's aura being read by 2 seconds by any other means. So if you have another perk like Alert or Fogwise, those perks will show you the aura of the killer for an extra 2 seconds. This perk is kind of interesting because it sounds bad on paper, but it's better in practice. I'm still going to give it a 2 though, because the value isn't that great, but for the situations where you are able to get value out of it, it's honestly not that bad. It's essentially like a survivor version of Lethal Pursuer. Like for example, if you're using Troubleshooter, which is the one that if you're in chase and you throw a pallet, it reveals the killer for like 6 seconds or something, extending that by an extra 2 seconds can be very useful. Or if you pair this perk with Alert, it's kind of a similar effect. So in those instances, it can give you some decent value. 2 seconds isn't that long, so the likelihood of it being game changing is kind of slim, but there is a chance that it can be extremely helpful. So honestly, not as bad as it sounds. Still pretty mediocre, but it's not as bad as it sounds. And his last perk is Moment of Glory, which activates after unlocking or rummaging a chest a total of 2 times. And this makes it so that when you become injured, you become broken for 60 seconds. And if you don't go down within those 60 seconds, you automatically get healed. And then this perk deactivates. So it's kind of similar to Second Wind, but with different prerequisites. And honestly, I don't tend to like perks that require you to open chests to activate, but the effect that this perk has is surprisingly useful. Being able to get a health state mid-chase is a very good effect. It's kind of similar to popping a syringe mid-chase, and it's super useful if the killer continues to chase you, but it's also useful if the killer doesn't decide to chase you after hitting you. Like if you're taking a hit, for example, there's almost no downside in taking that hit because you'll get healed a minute later. Like there's so many situations where this can be useful, even if you use it with Overcome, for example, which will give you that extra speed burst when you're hit, so it de-incentivizes the killer to continue chasing you, especially if there's other people nearby. It'll save you some pretty solid time. And I believe you can reactivate it if you unlock or rummage another 2 chests. So I'm going to give this perk a 3. I think the prerequisite is a little hefty, but the value that you can get out of it is substantial. This gives Trevor a total of 7 points, placing him in the B tier, and I'm going to put him just below Claudette because I think Moment of Glory is a really, really solid perk, and Eyes of Belmont can be used in some decent builds, but overall not quite good enough to compete with some of these perks. And last but not least, we have Taurie. Taurie's first perk is Clean Break, which activates after completing a healing action on another survivor. And while active, if you press the active ability button while being healed by another survivor, you become broken and are automatically healed after 60 seconds. And then this perk deactivates. I really want to like this perk, but realistically, getting value out of this perk is quite situational. It's like somewhat decent if you're trying to reset because you can have someone start your heal, which will save you a decent amount of time because they no longer have to heal you. But then you have to wait a whole minute before you're actually healed, which can be used to bait the killer into chasing you because they think you can get a down. So if you're getting really close to healed, you can try to bait the killer away from camping a hook, for example. But like obviously that was a very specific situation that I had to say to make this perk even get some decent value. I just think that this perk isn't really worth it. I think it'd be a lot better to just just heal the survivor normally or just stay injured and use a different perk. So I'm going to give this a score of 2. Then her next perk is Invocation Treacherous Crows, which is the second invocation perk to come to this game. And as a reminder, this is the one where you have to go into the back of the basement and get on your knees for 60 seconds. And once you finish with that, this perk activates, and whenever the killer scares a crow while a survivor is inside their terror radius, the killer's aura is revealed for 2 seconds, but you become injured and broken for the remainder of the trial. Again, I don't like these perks are so cool because they're really high risk, high reward, and you have this huge prerequisite to get this effect, but this effect isn't worth it to become injured for the remainder of the trial. Like, yes, seeing the killer's aura a lot is pretty nice, but not only do you have to have a survivor in their terror radius, the killer also has to scare a crow. So like, it's a pretty mediocre effect for a huge prerequisite and a huge downside. This perk is absolutely getting a score of 1. It's so bad. I think they're trying to play it safe because the release of boon perks probably scared them from doing anything high risk, high reward on the survivor's end again. But my God, this perk is awful. Like, invocation perks are just so bad. But then her last perk, which I'm sure you've heard about because a lot of people talked about it, especially when this character came out, and this is Shoulder the Burden. I want to give this perk a 4, but I think it's deserving of a 5, and let me explain why. Once per trial, as long as you're not on death hook, you can press the active ability button while standing in front of a hooked survivor to unhook them and trigger the following effect. You trade one hook state with that survivor, so you take one of their hook states and apply it to yourself, but it causes you to scream and become exposed for 40 seconds. This perk is so unbelievably good, especially against killers who are trying to play optimally, which is why I'm going to give this perk a 5. The most optimal way to play killer is to just tunnel one person out of the game because the game becomes so much easier in a 3v1. So if a survivor is able to use this perk, it essentially counters this playstyle entirely because you can spread the hooks out among all of your teammates. It's really good if you're in a survival with friends and all of you are using this perk because it essentially completely counters hard tunneling, which completely changes the way the killer has to play. Unbelievably good perk, and I would highly recommend getting this. So with a score of 5, that brings her to a total of 8, placing her in the A tier, but I'm going to put her in the S tier because I do think that Shoulder the Burden is absolutely worth buying this character for because it's such a useful perk to prevent hard tunneling. Anyway, guys, if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably like the one on screen now, so go check it out and see if I'm right.